The deepest regions of the ocean are not defined by darkness alone. They are defined by absence. Below a certain depth, light does not merely fade, it ceases to matter. Photons no longer structure space. Vision becomes irrelevant. What remains is pressure, chemistry, and time. These regions are described as lifeless not because nothing exists there, but because nothing familiar persists long enough to be named. Life, as commonly understood, does not thrive there, and yet something operates. The phrase "no light and no life" is a classification convenience. It marks the point where observation loses reference. Instruments continue to function, but interpretation becomes sparse. Biological expectations fail. Ecological models flatten. The environment is reduced to background. It is within this background that the creature hunts. Not actively, not visibly, not dramatically, but consistently. Hunting, here, does not imply pursuit in space. It implies exploitation of constraint. In regions without light, perception does not rely on sight. In regions without life, competition does not rely on interaction. What remains is energy gradient, pressure differential, and motion through silence. The creature aligns with these fundamentals. It does not search for prey in the traditional sense. There is little prey to search for. Instead, it intercepts rare transitions, the movement of matter, the intrusion of warmth, the arrival of sound, the descent of objects not meant to be there. Where nothing should arrive, arrival becomes signal. The absence of life simplifies the environment. Noise collapses. Biological interference disappears. The water column becomes stable in its emptiness. Any deviation stands out not to observers, but to systems adapted to nothingness. The creature is adapted to nothingness. In darkness, orientation does not depend on direction. It depends on consistency. Pressure gradients replace landmarks. Chemical traces replace silhouettes. Time replaces distance. The creature hunts in time. It does not need speed. It does not need aggression. It does not need awareness in any familiar sense. It remains where arrivals are slow and departures are slower, where objects sink, stall, and linger because nothing else competes for them. There is no chase. There is only interception. In regions without light, sound behaves differently. It travels farther, cleaner, less cluttered. In regions without life, there is nothing to mask it. No clicks, no movement, no background rhythm. Silence becomes absolute. Within absolute silence, even weak disturbances are sufficient. The creature does not generate sound. It does not reflect it consistently. It allows sound to pass, bend, disperse. When something enters the region, a fragment of debris, a failing structure, a drifting organism, the sound it carries is altered subtly. That alteration is enough. The creature does not need to know what the object is. It only needs to know that it does not belong. Belonging is rare in these depths. Anything that arrives is temporary by definition. Temporary things are harvested. There are no remains. In the absence of life, decomposition does not proceed normally. Organic processes stall. What is taken does not leave trace in expected ways. No feeding marks are found. No biological residue accumulates. The event collapses into absence. From an observational standpoint, nothing happens. Sensors register nothing abnormal. Pressure equalizes. Sound fades. Chemical composition returns to baseline. The system logs silence. This silence is misleading. Hunting without light produces no spectacle. Hunting without life produces no evidence. The act leaves no signature that can be distinguished from environmental equilibrium. Equilibrium hides everything. The creature does not alter its environment, because alteration would create pattern. Pattern would invite interpretation. Interpretation would require persistence. The creature persists by avoiding persistence. It occupies depths where change is rare and slow, where systems assume inactivity, where monitoring becomes infrequent because nothing is expected to occur. Expectation is the predator's camouflage. In such regions, even technology behaves differently. Instruments drift, power consumption is minimized, sampling rates drop, data is compressed aggressively, anything marginal is averaged away. The creature hunts inside the margins. It does not need to evade detection. Detection is not configured for absence. It is configured for anomaly. The creature produces none. It does not increase energy in the system. It does not decrease it measurably. It redistributes. Redistribution without loss is invisible. There are moments rare, brief, when something descends deeper than intended. A structure fails. A vessel fragment sinks. A probe exceeds its tolerance. In these moments, the environment changes slightly, not enough to alarm, enough to be noticed. The creature aligns. What happens next is not recorded. The object does not return. Telemetry ceases. The failure is attributed to pressure, to material fatigue, to depth. These explanations are correct. They are also incomplete. The creature hunts where explanation ends, not because it is unknown, but because it operates in a regime where knowing has no leverage, where light is useless, where life is irrelevant, where events do not propagate upward into meaning. The deepest regions of the ocean are quiet not because nothing occurs there, but because nothing that occurs there insists on being known. The creature does not surface. It does not migrate upward. It does not intrude into relevance. It remains where absence is stable. This is why it is never discovered, not because it hides, but because it hunts in places where discovery has no function, where there is no light, where there is no life, where nothing is expected to happen, and where something does, without leaving a reason to believe it ever did. At extreme depth, the concept of environment simplifies. Variables collapse into constants. Temperature stabilizes. Pressure dominates. Chemistry equalizes. In such regions, complexity does not vanish. It slows. Processes extend over longer durations. Interactions stretch across time rather than space. Life, as it is commonly measured, becomes statistically irrelevant. It does not disappear. It fails to register. The creature functions inside this failure. It does not rely on vision, sound, or biological signaling in the conventional sense. Those modalities assume contrast. At depth, contrast dissolves. What remains are gradients so slight they appear uniform unless something interrupts them. The creature detects interruption, not presence. It is sensitive to the arrival of difference in a domain where difference is rare. Hunting here is not pursuit. It is alignment with inevitability. Objects that descend past a certain boundary do not return. Energy leaks slowly. Structures fatigue. Materials fail. The creature does not cause these outcomes, it positions itself where they conclude. When an object crosses into this regime, the final stages of its existence are predetermined. The creature intersects that final stage. There is no struggle. There is no acceleration. Motion is already constrained by pressure and density. The creature exploits constraint rather than overcoming it. Where nothing else competes, efficiency becomes absolute. Consumption does not resemble feeding. It resembles absorption. Matter is redistributed into the environment without traceable residue. Balance is maintained. From above, nothing changes. Instruments record loss of signal, not interaction. The surrounding medium restabilizes quickly. No turbulence persists. No thermal anomaly survives. The system returns to baseline, reinforcing the assumption that nothing intervened. This assumption is correct within operational limits. The creature does not introduce novelty. It does not disturb equilibrium beyond tolerance. It exists as a boundary condition, the final term in processes already underway. In regions without life, processes terminate quietly. In regions without light, termination cannot be observed. The creature occupies the intersection of these constraints. Time behaves differently there. Without biological cycles, without day or season, duration loses structure. Events are not sequenced in familiar ways. The creature hunts across extended intervals, responding to rare intrusions separated by long silence. Silence does not imply waiting. Waiting implies anticipation. The creature does not anticipate. It remains. It does not migrate. It does not expand territory. Territory implies competition. There is none. The absence of life removes pressure to adapt rapidly. Change occurs slowly, if at all. The creature persists because persistence is the default state. Detection systems fail, not because the creature evades them, but because they are not designed to observe conclusions. They observe transitions, emissions, disruptions. The creature produces none of these at detectable scale. It absorbs what arrives at the end of its trajectory. Endpoints do not radiate signal. What is taken does not vanish. It dissolves into the deep environment, redistributed beyond classification. Chemical traces equalize. Physical remnants are crushed, folded, incorporated. No pattern accumulates. No anomaly persists long enough to demand explanation. The deepest zones are often described as empty. This description is functionally useful. It allows systems to deprioritize them. Monitoring becomes intermittent. Attention shifts upward, toward regions where interaction is frequent and interpretable. The creature hunts within that deprioritization. It exists where nothing is expected, and therefore nothing is confirmed. Where loss is assumed to be mechanical. Where silence is interpreted as absence rather than outcome. The lack of life is not an obstacle. It is a stabilizing factor. Without competing organisms, without scavengers, without observers, the process remains clean. The creature does not accumulate evidence. It does not leave impact. It does not force revision of models. It remains compatible with all explanations that already exist. This compatibility is its protection. It is never discovered because discovery would serve no function. There is nothing to respond to, nothing to mitigate, nothing to adapt against. The creature does not spread, does not escalate, does not intrude upward into relevance. It hunts where light cannot follow, and life does not persist, not because those conditions conceal it, but because those conditions remove the need for concealment altogether. Nothing looks for it there. Nothing needs to. And so the process continues, deep below relevance, deep below interpretation, where arrival is rare, disappearance is normal, and something operates quietly at the end of all trajectories without ever needing to be seen. Below that depth, causality itself becomes diffuse. Effects no longer point cleanly back to causes. Pressure, time, and material fatigue explain almost everything, and what they do not explain is folded into uncertainty without resistance. The creature operates inside this diffusion. It does not interrupt causal chains, it completes them. Where descent becomes irreversible, where structure gives way to compression, where motion slows into inevitability, the creature is already present. It does not arrive, it does not depart. Arrival and departure require reference points. At these depths, reference collapses. There is no above that matters, no below that differs. Space becomes uniform enough that location loses meaning. The creature hunts without position, anchored not to coordinates but to conditions. When conditions align pressure sufficient, silence complete, absence stabilized, the interaction occurs. This interaction is not violent. Violence produces disturbance. Disturbance propagates. Propagation creates signal. The creature avoids signal by remaining congruent with the environment's dominant forces. It moves at the same rate as collapse. It yields where yielding is already underway. It absorbs where absorption is already guaranteed. To an external system, the event is indistinguishable from mechanical failure. To the environment, it is indistinguishable from equilibrium. The creature does not need to mask its presence, because presence itself is not a category here. Only persistence and termination exist, and termination is common. The lack of life simplifies the process further. No biological feedback loops interfere. No scavenging chain redistributes remains in detectable ways. No metabolic byproducts accumulate. What is taken is not consumed in a biological sense. It is processed into the deep environment until it is no longer discrete. Discreteness is the first thing to vanish at depth. This is why nothing accumulates. Accumulation would create history. History would allow inference. Inference would demand attention. The creature ensures that nothing survives long enough to be inferred. It hunts without repetition in observable terms, even though the process itself is continuous. Continuity here is not a sequence of events, but a condition that never resolves. Long periods of absolute stillness are punctuated by singular intrusions, a fragment, a descent, a failure. Each intrusion is final. There is no aftermath. The environment closes behind it immediately. Monitoring systems do not fail here. They function correctly within their design. They record pressure increase, signal attenuation, structural overload. When telemetry ceases, the explanation is already sufficient. There is no missing variable that needs to be introduced. The creature remains outside the explanatory surface, not hidden beneath it. This is the defining feature. The creature does not exist as an unknown waiting to be discovered. It exists as a known, irrelevant something that, even if perfectly described, would not change response, behavior, or design. It does not threaten surface systems. It does not migrate upward. It does not multiply. It does not intrude into zones where life or light would force recognition. It hunts only where recognition has no value. In places without light, observation fails by definition. In places without life, consequence fails to propagate. Without propagation, events remain local. Without locality crossing into relevance, nothing is learned. The creature persists because persistence requires nothing. No energy surplus, no adaptation, no competition. It remains because the deep remains. As long as there are regions where silence is complete and absence is stable, the process will continue. Something will always reach the end of its trajectory. And there, where nothing follows, where no signal returns, where explanation stops being questioned, the creature will already be present, not waiting, not watching, not choosing, simply completing what depth, pressure, and time have already begun. In these depths, the idea of predation loses its surface meaning. There is no pursuit, because there is nowhere to pursue to. There is no evasion, because nothing escapes downward indefinitely. Motion is unidirectional, governed by pressure and gravity long before intent could matter. The creature does not choose targets. Targets select themselves by crossing into conditions that cannot sustain return. This is why the creature does not hunt frequently. Frequency implies abundance. Abundance does not exist here. Intrusions are rare, separated by long spans of absolute quiet. These spans are not empty time. They are the environment's default state. The creature exists within that default, unchanged by duration. Time does not accumulate pressure on it. Nothing ages meaningfully in a place where processes are already at their terminal speed. When an intrusion occurs, the interaction is immediate, but not abrupt. There is no threshold moment that can be isolated, no instant where presence becomes detectable. The event stretches across a short interval and then collapses back into stillness. If measured, it would appear as a smooth continuation of decline, indistinguishable from failure curves already expected at such depths. This indistinguishability is critical. The creature does not introduce new behavior. It operates strictly within known physical limits. It never violates constraints. It never accelerates outcomes beyond what pressure and time already guarantee. It simply ensures completion. Completion leaves no signature. Systems that fail at depth are expected to fail completely. Partial failure would be anomalous. Total disappearance is normal. The creature aligns itself with what is already categorized as normal. In doing so, it removes itself from inquiry. Inquiry requires anomaly. Anomaly never forms. The absence of light ensures that no visual confirmation is possible. The absence of life ensures that no secondary biological evidence exists. Without scavengers, without reproduction, without metabolic waste, there is nothing to observe after the event. The deep does not remember. Memory is biological. The deep is not. Without memory, repetition does not accumulate. Without accumulation, probability remains theoretical. The creature could act endlessly, without ever becoming statistically relevant. Its activity does not scale into knowledge. This is not stealth. Stealth implies opposition. This is alignment with irrelevance. The creature exists precisely where relevance cannot survive. It does not need to patrol. It does not need to search. It remains distributed across conditions rather than locations. Wherever the environment reaches its most stable, most silent state, the creature is functionally present. Presence is not physical occupation. It is readiness embedded in the medium itself. This blurs the distinction between organism and environment. The creature is not separate from the deep in the way surface predators are separate from their terrain. It behaves as an extension of the depth's final logic. Where descent ends, it acts. Because of this, no boundary can be drawn around it. Boundaries require contrast. Contrast does not persist here. Everything converges toward uniformity. The creature converges with it. If it were removed, nothing would change above. If it never existed, explanations would remain sufficient. Pressure, fatigue, collapse, silence, these are enough. The creature adds no new outcome. It only removes uncertainty at the end. That is why it is never suspected. Suspicion arises when outcomes exceed explanation. Here, outcomes are always smaller than explanation. They disappear inside it. The creature is hidden not by darkness, but by adequacy. Adequate explanations are impermeable. As long as depth is treated as a terminus, as long as darkness is treated as closure, as long as lifelessness is treated as finality, nothing will be looked for beyond them. The creature occupies that beyond not spatially, but conceptually. It hunts where investigation stops, and as long as systems continue to accept that nothing meaningful occurs where there is no light and no life, the process will remain intact, uninterrupted, and invisible, completing trajectories silently, one rare intrusion at a time, without ever creating a reason to believe it exists. What distinguishes this process from mere decay is not outcome, but precision. Decay is indiscriminate. It unfolds wherever conditions permit, unevenly, leaving gradients and partial remains. Here, there are none. What arrives does not linger in intermediate states. It does not scatter evidence upward. It does not fracture into detectable stages. The creature's role is to eliminate intermediacy. It converts descent into conclusion without residue that could be sampled later. This precision is not mechanical. It does not rely on tools, jaws, or force as those terms are usually applied. It relies on timing within an environment where timing is the only variable that still matters. Pressure defines the window. Silence defines the boundary. When both align, interaction becomes unavoidable. The creature does not initiate. It synchronizes. Synchronization is invisible because it leaves no leading edge. From an external perspective, events appear overdetermined. Failure curves match expectation. Signal loss coincides with predicted thresholds. Material collapse follows known limits. Every model remains valid. The creature does not invalidate them. It inhabits the overlap where multiple explanations already agree. Agreement is the strongest concealment. In places without life, causality is simplified. There are no chains of consumption, no secondary actors, no delayed effects. One process ends and nothing follows. The creature ensures that nothing follows cleanly. It prevents the formation of secondary processes that might radiate evidence back into observable zones. This is why there are no anomalies to correlate. Losses remain isolated. Each event is self-contained, complete, and final. There is no pattern because there is nothing left to pattern. Analysts see single points that do not connect. Single points are dismissed as noise. Noise is expected at depth. The creature benefits from expectation not because it manipulates it, but because expectation is already aligned with disappearance. At these depths, disappearance is the default. The creature merely guarantees that default resolves fully. If life were present, remnants would circulate. If light were present, movement would cast shadow. Without either, the environment enforces erasure. The creature is an erasure mechanism embedded within conditions that already erase. This is why it does not expand upward. Above, processes are incomplete. Evidence survives. Light reflects. Life reacts. Upward migration would introduce friction. Friction produces signal. Signal produces response. The creature does not seek response. It remains where response cannot form. Its persistence is not a threat to surface systems because it does not alter probabilities that matter above. It does not increase loss rates beyond expected margins. It does not cluster events. It does not force recalibration. It exists below the threshold where intervention would be justified. Justification governs attention. Without justification, nothing changes. The deepest ocean remains categorized as terminal space, a place where things end, not where things act. That categorization is functional, efficient, and accurate enough. The creature survives inside that accuracy gap, not because the gap is large, but because it is sufficient. As long as depth is treated as final, the final stage will never be examined. And so the process continues, embedded in silence, synchronized with collapse, operating only at the point where explanation stops, needing to ask questions, hunting not for life, not for prey, but for endings that have already been set in motion. At this depth, even the idea of agency becomes unstable. Agency implies choice between alternatives. Here, alternatives collapse. There is only continuation or termination, and continuation is temporary by definition. The creature does not choose because choice would imply variability. Variability would leave traces. It operates instead as a fixed condition that activates only when everything else has already converged. This is why it cannot be isolated. Isolation requires contrast. Contrast requires persistence of difference. In an environment where pressure homogenizes, temperature equalizes, and silence dominates, difference cannot survive long enough to be separated. The creature dissolves into that uniformity until the moment interaction becomes unavoidable, and then it dissolves again immediately afterward. Nothing about this requires intelligence, as it is usually defined. Intelligence presumes adaptation under pressure from other agents. There are no other agents here. There is no competition. There is no escalation. There is no reason to optimize beyond what already works. The creature remains exactly sufficient. Sufficiency is indistinguishable from absence. This sufficiency is what allows the system above to remain stable. Losses at depth never force reevaluation because they never exceed expectation. Each disappearance reinforces the belief that the environment is simply unforgiving. That belief is correct. It is also incomplete. The incompleteness is harmless, and harmless incompleteness is never investigated. Investigation follows impact. Impact never propagates upward. The creature's hunting does not ripple. It terminates. Termination does not echo. Without echo, there is nothing to triangulate, nothing to reconstruct. Even hypothetical modeling fails because there is no residual signal to anchor speculation. Speculation without anchor dissipates quickly. The deep enforces this discipline. It strips events of narrative. Things do not happen there in sequences. They happen once and then are absorbed. The creature exists as part of that absorption, not as an interruption of it. This is why language struggles to describe it. Any attempt to frame it as an organism, a predator, or an actor introduces assumptions that do not apply. It is more accurate to describe it as a function that activates at the terminal boundary of descent. A function that ensures that nothing returns incomplete. Completion is its only behavior. In regions without light, observation cannot interfere. In regions without life, consequence cannot circulate. Together, these conditions form a closed system. Within closed systems, events do not announce themselves. They resolve internally. The creature is internal resolution. Nothing about this demands secrecy. Secrecy implies something is being hidden from someone. Here, there is no observer to hide from. There is only irrelevance. Irrelevance is stronger than concealment because it removes motivation to look. As long as deep regions are treated as endpoints rather than domains, whatever operates there will remain unexamined. The creature does not depend on darkness or emptiness for protection. It depends on finality. Finality ends inquiry. And so, where there is no light and no life, something continues to operate with perfect alignment to conditions completing failures, absorbing arrivals, ensuring that descent truly ends not as an anomaly, not as a mystery, but as the last quiet process, in a place where nothing is expected to persist long enough to be known. What ultimately protects this process is not depth, darkness, or distance, but conceptual closure. The deep is treated as an end state, an area beyond return, beyond recovery, beyond relevance. Once something crosses into it, attention withdraws, monitoring degrades, resolution drops, interpretation simplifies. This withdrawal is rational. It preserves resources. It prevents fixation on losses that cannot be reversed. The creature exists entirely inside this rational withdrawal. It does not need to create uncertainty. It relies on certainty. Certainty that nothing meaningful emerges from such depths. Certainty that failure there is total and self-explanatory. Certainty that no secondary mechanism needs to be considered. These certainties are stable because they are almost always correct. Almost is enough. The creature does not undermine models. It completes them. Models already predict collapse, loss, disappearance. The creature ensures that these predictions resolve cleanly, without ambiguity, without residual data that might complicate interpretation. It removes the small inconsistencies that could otherwise accumulate into questions. Questions are dangerous. Questions extend attention downward. Attention would change behavior. Behavior change would introduce signal. Signal would break invisibility. The creature, therefore, exists in perfect alignment with institutional disinterest, not indifference in the emotional sense, but disinterest as policy. Depth is not where problems are solved. It is where they are closed. Closure is final. In places where there is no light, nothing can be verified. In places where there is no life, nothing can respond. These two absences combine into a condition where events cannot propagate upward. Without propagation, there is no feedback. Without feedback, systems do not learn. The creature hunts inside this learning dead zone, It does not need to increase efficiency. It does not need to expand range. It does not need redundancy. Nothing competes with it. Nothing pressures it. The environment itself enforces exclusivity. Any object that enters is isolated by depth long before interaction occurs. Isolation simplifies everything. This is why there are no partial recoveries, no anomalous fragments, no unexplained residues that surface later. What reaches the deep does not circulate. It is compressed, dissolved, incorporated. The creature's role is to prevent exception. Exception would imply leakage. Leakage would attract interest. Interest would be dangerous. The deep remains interesting only as an abstraction, as a place where things vanish. As a terminal category, the creature survives because the category holds. It does not stalk. It does not ambush. It does not react. Reaction implies stimulus. Stimulus implies signal. Signal implies disturbance. The creature avoids disturbance by existing only where disturbance is already expected and ignored. The absence of life is not a limitation. It is a stabilizer. Life introduces cycles, reproduction, waste, variation. Without life, there is only slow physics and long time. Perfect conditions for processes that must remain unnoticed indefinitely. The absence of light is not concealment, it is irrelevance. Seeing would not help here. Even if vision were possible, there would be nothing to compare against, nothing to contextualize. Observation requires contrast. Contrast cannot form. Thus, the creature remains undescribed, not because it is unknown, but because description would add nothing. It would not change outcome, policy, or behavior. It would simply exist as an unnecessary detail at the end of already sufficient explanations. Unnecessary details are discarded. As long as the deep continues to function as a place where trajectories end, something will continue to operate there, ensuring endings remain clean, silent, and final, where there is no light, where there is no life. Where inquiry stops not because answers are hidden, but because answers are no longer required. At these depths, even failure loses definition. Failure implies deviation from intended function. But nothing that reaches this regime is intended to persist. The systems that descend are already operating beyond their design envelope. Their loss is not an error, it is an expected resolution. The creature aligns itself with that expectation so precisely that it becomes indistinguishable from the environment's own corrective mechanisms. This alignment removes the need for attribution. When something vanishes, there is no impulse to ask what intervened. Intervention would suggest agency. Agency would suggest variability. Variability would suggest risk. None of these are required to explain disappearance at terminal depth. The explanation is already complete. Completeness prevents inquiry. The creature does not disrupt this completeness, it sharpens it. By ensuring that no intermediate states survive, it prevents ambiguity from surfacing later. Ambiguity is the only thing that could reopen closed explanations. The creature eliminates ambiguity at the moment it could form. In regions without life, nothing reacts. In regions without light, nothing reflects. Without reaction and reflection, there is no feedback. Without feedback, systems cannot adjust. The creature operates where adjustment is impossible and therefore unnecessary. This makes its persistence effortless. It does not adapt because nothing challenges it. It does not change because change would be redundant. The environment already enforces its optimal state. Pressure, time, and silence maintain equilibrium indefinitely. If the creature were absent, the deep would still consume arrivals. Structures would still fail. Signals would still vanish. The difference would be subtle, small inconsistencies, partial remnants, data fragments that resist clean explanation. These inconsistencies would accumulate slowly, but even accumulation would struggle to escape the depth's conceptual gravity. The creature prevents that accumulation. It does not accelerate destruction. It does not intensify collapse. It simply guarantees closure. Closure is valuable. Closure keeps models intact. Closure keeps attention focused elsewhere. Closure keeps depth classified as terminal rather than active. Activity would demand monitoring. Monitoring would demand interpretation. Interpretation would demand language. Language would demand persistence. The creature ensures persistence never occurs. This is why it is never found by accident. Accidents reveal what was not accounted for. Here, everything is accounted for in advance. The accounting is coarse but sufficient. Sufficient accounting closes the door on finer detail. Detail is dangerous. Detail invites revision. Revision invites scrutiny. Scrutiny would introduce light. Light would change nothing physically, but it would change relevance. Relevance is the only threat. The creature remains perfectly irrelevant. It does not emerge from the deep, because emergence would create narrative. Narratives propagate. Propagation breaks isolation. Isolation is absolute. Here, the deep does not communicate upward except through loss, and loss is already understood. Thus, the process continues unchallenged. Rare arrivals descend. Final stages unfold. Silence follows. Systems above log completion and move on. Nothing remains to question. Where there is no light, observation has no leverage. Where there is no life, consequence has no pathway. Between these two absences, something continues to operate, not as a mystery, not as a predator in any conventional sense, but as the final condition of descent itself, ensuring that what reaches the end does not return incomplete, unresolved, or remembered. And as long as the deep remains defined as an ending rather than a place, that condition will persist, quietly completing trajectories in a region where nothing is expected to survive long enough to matter. In this regime, even explanation becomes static. Explanations do not evolve because they are never stressed. They sit at equilibrium, reinforced by every subsequent disappearance that behaves exactly as predicted. Prediction here is minimal. It assumes only that nothing returns. The creature thrives inside this minimalism. It does not need complex models to conceal itself. It benefits from the absence of modeling altogether. Modeling is reserved for systems that interact. Interaction produces data. Data demands structure. At terminal depth, interaction is one-sided. Objects enter. Nothing exits. This asymmetry collapses the need for structure. The creature occupies the asymmetry itself. What is most notable is the absence of escalation. Over time, nothing accumulates into threat. Losses remain sparse, isolated, and uncorrelated. There is no cluster, no trend line that rises above noise. Without trend, there is no signal. Without signal, there is no policy response. Policy governs attention more strongly than curiosity. Curiosity might notice irregularities. Policy ignores them unless they scale. The creature never scales. It operates at exactly the rate the environment allows. Rare, final, self-contained. It hunts slowly because slowness is enforced. Anything faster would stand out. Anything more frequent would suggest pattern. Pattern would be dangerous. The absence of life plays a critical role here. Life produces excess waste, heat, chemical gradients, biological noise. Excess creates traceability. Without life, processes resolve cleanly. Nothing feeds on remnants. Nothing disturbs conclusions. The deep remains chemically quiet, mechanically quiet, informationally quiet. Quiet is not emptiness. Quiet is closure. The creature uses closure as its medium. It does not create silence. It arrives when silence is already complete. In that silence, even massive events fail to register as events. They register as the continuation of nothing. From the perspective of surface systems, the deep is not active space. It is lost space. Once something enters, it is written off. This write-off is immediate and final. No resources are allocated to what has already been classified as unrecoverable. The creature exists inside that classification. Classification is more powerful than concealment. Concealment can be challenged. Classification cannot unless outcomes change. Outcomes never change. Even hypothetical detection would be useless. If perfect information were suddenly available, it would not alter decisions. There would still be no recovery, no mitigation, no response. The creature does not threaten infrastructure, populations, or systems that matter above. It simply completes what depth already promises. Threat requires leverage. There is none. Thus, the creature remains not just unseen, but unneeded. Unneeded knowledge is discarded automatically. Entire domains of reality are filtered out not because they are false, but because they are operationally irrelevant. Operational irrelevance is absolute. Where there is no light, nothing can be verified. Where there is no life, nothing can propagate consequence. Between these conditions, reality continues without observers, without memory, without narrative. The creature is embedded in that continuation, indistinguishable from the final logic of the deep itself. It does not watch the surface. It does not anticipate discovery. It does not respond to intrusion. It simply persists as a function that activates only when everything else has already failed, ensuring that failure resolves completely. And as long as the deep remains the place where systems stop caring not out of ignorance, but out of necessity, something will continue to hunt there, silently, precisely, and permanently beyond the reach of relevance. At extreme depth, relevance collapses faster than matter. The farther an event is from consequence, the less language is allocated to describe it. What cannot influence decisions is not modeled. What is not modeled ceases to exist operationally. The deep is governed by this logic. It is not unknown. It is resolved by exclusion. The creature exists entirely inside that exclusion, protected not by secrecy, but by the efficiency of forgetting. For systems above, the deep represents a terminal boundary where responsibility ends. Once an object crosses into that regime, accountability dissolves. Loss is accepted as a condition of operation rather than a failure to be corrected. This acceptance is not passive. It is codified. Procedures end. Budgets close. Attention shifts upward. The creature survives inside this procedural closure. It does not disrupt flow. It does not create spikes. It does not introduce variance that survives aggregation. Its activity never rises above background expectation. Every disappearance reinforces the belief that the deep behaves exactly as it should. The belief becomes stronger with time because it is never contradicted. The creature never contradicts it. Contradiction would require residue. Residue never survives. The absence of light ensures that no direct observation interferes with the process. The absence of life ensures that no secondary processes amplify it. Together, these conditions create a zone where events do not cascade. Cascades are how surface systems learn. Without cascades, nothing propagates upward into awareness. The creature does not hunt frequently, but frequency is irrelevant here. What matters is inevitability. Anything that reaches sufficient depth is already committed to termination. The creature aligns itself precisely at that commitment point. It does not accelerate destruction. It removes uncertainty from it. It ensures that dissent does not produce ambiguous outcomes. Ambiguity is the only thing that could force reinterpretation. The creature prevents ambiguity by operating where interpretation has already stopped. At that boundary, even complex interactions simplify into inevitability. Pressure replaces force. Time replaces motion. Silence replaces signal. The creature does not fight these substitutions. it becomes one of them. This is why no boundary can be drawn around it. Boundaries require difference that persists across observation. Here, difference collapses immediately. Whatever the creature does is inseparable from what depth itself does. The distinction between environment and organism becomes meaningless. Meaninglessness is stable. From above, the deep remains classified as inactive space. It is not monitored continuously because monitoring would produce nothing actionable. Any data returned would confirm only what is already known, that nothing returns. This confirmation loop closes inquiry permanently. The creature benefits from confirmation more than from ignorance. Ignorance invites curiosity. Confirmation ends it. The creature is not ancient in the mythic sense. Age implies history. History implies records. There are none. Time at depth does not accumulate narrative. Events do not stack. They vanish. The creature persists because nothing erodes it. There is no evolutionary pressure, no competition, no environment shift that demands change. Stability is enforced by physics itself. If life were present, decay would scatter evidence. If light were present, movement would produce contrast. Without either, the deep enforces erasure so completely that even large-scale interactions resolve into nothing. The creature is optimized for this regime not by adaptation, but by necessity. Anything incompatible with erasure would leave trace and be eliminated by relevance. The creature leaves no trace, because trace would be anomalous. Anomalies are the only things that threaten irrelevance. The deep does not generate anomalies, it absorbs them. This absorption is the final protection. It ensures that no matter how many times the process repeats, nothing accumulates into pattern. Without pattern, probability remains abstract. Without probability, risk is dismissed. Without risk, attention never shifts. Thus, the creature remains indefinitely active without ever being considered active. It does not intrude into explanation because explanation does not reach that far. It does not require darkness to hide. Darkness merely removes the illusion that seeing would help. It hunts where outcomes are already sealed, where systems have already withdrawn interest, where silence is treated as completion. It exists not at the beginning of events, nor in their middle, but exactly at the point where everything else has already stopped caring. And as long as there are depths defined as final, as long as there are regions written off as beyond relevance, something will continue to operate there not as a monster, not as a mystery, but as the quiet mechanism that ensures endings remain absolute, clean, and unrecorded, in places where no light reaches and no life insists on being remembered. At this depth, the concept of survival no longer applies. Survival presumes continuity under threat, adaptation in response to pressure, persistence in spite of interference. None of these conditions exist here. There is no threat because there is no competition. There is no interference because nothing else operates independently. There is no pressure to persist because persistence is guaranteed by stillness itself. The creature does not survive. It endures, which is a fundamentally different state. Endurance here is passive, but not inert. It is maintained by alignment with conditions that never change in meaningful ways. Pressure remains constant. Temperature varies only marginally. Chemistry drifts slowly toward equilibrium. These forces do not challenge the creature. They define it. It is less an inhabitant of the deep than a function of it, expressed only when necessary and otherwise indistinguishable from background. Necessity is rare. The deep does not receive frequent arrivals. Most trajectories terminate long before reaching these zones. Only a fraction of failures descend far enough to matter here. This scarcity is not a limitation. It is a stabilizer. Scarcity ensures that nothing accumulates quickly. Nothing clusters. Nothing produces statistical weight. Each event remains isolated, explainable, complete. Isolation is absolute. There are no witnesses, no secondary effects, no reverberations. The absence of life ensures that nothing reacts. The absence of light ensures that nothing reflects. The absence of recovery ensures that nothing is examined after the fact. The entire chain collapses inward and disappears. This is the environment the creature requires, and the environment provides it automatically. What distinguishes this from simple disappearance is intent. But intent here is not conscious or directional. It is structural. The creature exists where endings require reinforcement. Where material failure alone might leave ambiguity, it removes ambiguity. Where collapse might be partial, it ensures completeness. Where a trace might persist long enough to confuse explanation, it prevents persistence. It does not hurry. It does not delay. It operates at exactly the pace imposed by the deep. Time stretches until urgency dissolves. Without urgency, there is no escalation. Without escalation, nothing rises into relevance. Surface systems are built around escalation. Alerts, thresholds, anomalies, all depend on something crossing a line. Nothing here ever crosses a line. Everything fades into expectation before it can be framed as an event. This is why the deep remains stable as a category. It is not revisited because it does not surprise. It does not surprise because it does not produce outcomes that contradict assumption. The creature is the mechanism by which contradiction is prevented. Contradiction is dangerous. Contradiction forces revision. Revision invites attention. Attention would bring light, not physically, but conceptually. Conceptual light would change classification. Classification protects the creature. As long as the deep is defined as terminal space, whatever operates there will be excluded from concern. The creature does not need to escape notice. It exists below the threshold where notice would matter. It does not resist study. Study never reaches it. There is no incentive to look closer. Closer inspection would not change response. No recovery would be possible. No mitigation would be effective. The knowledge would remain inert. Inert knowledge is discarded. Thus, the creature persists without record, without description, without myth. It is not feared, because fear requires anticipation. It is not revered, because reverence requires awareness. It simply remains as part of the deep's final logic, activating only when something reaches the point where nothing else follows. Where there is no light, nothing can be confirmed. Where there is no life, nothing can respond. Between these absences, something continues to operate not in opposition to understanding, but beyond the point where understanding has any remaining function. Beyond this point, even terminology becomes misleading. Words like creature, hunting, present survive only because language requires placeholders. In reality, what operates here does not fit into categories that assume interaction, opposition, or exchange. There is nothing to oppose. There is nothing to exchange. There is only completion of processes that have already lost relevance elsewhere. The deep is not hostile. Hostility implies intent towards something. Here, there is nothing to be hostile toward. The environment is simply final. What reaches it is already excluded from return. The creature aligns with that exclusion so fully that it becomes inseparable from it. It does not add danger. It removes uncertainty. Uncertainty is the only remaining variable at terminal depth. Pressure explains collapse. Time explains degradation. Silence explains disappearance. These explanations are sufficient for every practical purpose. The creature does not challenge them. It inhabits the narrow space where explanations overlap so completely that no gap remains for doubt to enter. Doubt is the precursor to investigation. Investigation never arrives. Because nothing escapes upward, Nothing feeds back into revision. Models remain coarse and stable. They do not sharpen because there is no incentive. Precision would not change outcome. The deep remains a place where things end, not where things act. This classification is essential. Without it, systems would waste resources chasing irrecoverable losses. Attention would be misallocated. Decision-making would stall. The creature exists because efficiency demands such classifications remain intact. It does not threaten efficiency. It protects it. By ensuring that endings remain clean, by preventing partial outcomes, by eliminating ambiguous residues, it maintains the illusion that depth itself is sufficient explanation. In this sense, the creature is not an anomaly, but a stabilizing factor. Stability is invisible when it works. There are no cycles here, no rhythms, no seasons. Events are too rare to form cadence. The creature exists across these vast intervals without accumulating wear or change. It does not age meaningfully. Aging requires metabolism, repair, stress. None of these apply in a regime where nothing competes and nothing escalates. The absence of life removes contingency. The absence of light removes verification. Together, they create a closed domain where nothing demands to be known. If the creature were suddenly absent, the difference would be imperceptible at first. Only over extremely long durations would small inconsistencies begin to appear. Fragments that persist too long, signals that decay imperfectly, losses that leave questions rather than conclusions. Even then, these inconsistencies would struggle to rise above noise. Noise dominates the deep. The creature ensures noise remains noise. It does not act often, but frequency is irrelevant. One clean ending is enough. Each time something reaches that final boundary, the process resolves fully. Nothing returns. Nothing accumulates. Nothing insists. Insistence is the enemy of invisibility. The creature never insists. This is why it is never encountered accidentally. Accidental discovery depends on persistence, on something remaining where it should not. Here, nothing remains. Everything that reaches the deep completes its trajectory. The creature is simply there, embedded in that completion, not observing, not waiting, not reacting, existing as the last silent condition applied to arrivals that have already been written off elsewhere. And as long as the deepest regions continue to be treated as endpoints rather than environments, as long as no light reaches them and no life circulates within them, the process will continue uninterrupted, quiet, precise, and perfectly aligned with the assumption that nothing meaningful happens there at all. At the deepest limit of relevance, even disappearance becomes routine. It no longer registers as loss because loss implies value, and value cannot survive where recovery is impossible. Objects that descend into this regime are already stripped of importance by distance, by cost, by probability. The creature operates only after that stripping is complete. It never removes anything that still matters. This is the final alignment. Nothing it encounters is contested. Nothing is mourned. Nothing is expected back. The creature does not take. It finalizes. It ensures that what has been abandoned remains abandoned. That what has crossed the boundary does not reintroduce uncertainty into systems that depend on closure. Closure is essential at scale. Without closure, attention fragments. Resources scatter. Decision-making slows. The deep functions as a pressure valve for complexity, a place where unresolved processes are allowed to end without consequence. The creature exists as part of that function, embedded in the logic of letting go. It does not belong to an ecosystem, because ecosystems require circulation. Nothing circulates here. Matter moves downward, compresses, dissolves, equalizes. Energy dissipates slowly. Information vanishes almost immediately. The creature does not recycle. It does not return nutrients. It does not propagate itself. It remains static relative to the flow of everything else. This static nature is critical. Anything that reproduced would introduce pattern. Pattern would introduce history. History would demand explanation. The creature avoids history by avoiding multiplication. It remains singular, not in number, but in behavior. Every interaction is complete unto itself, leaving nothing that could be linked to another. Linkage is how knowledge forms. Knowledge never forms here. The absence of life ensures that nothing witnesses the process. The absence of light ensures that nothing frames it. Together, they create a domain where events are unobservable not because they are hidden, but because observation has no leverage. Seeing would not alter outcome. Recording would not enable response. Response defines relevance. There is no response here. Surface systems are built on escalation. Something goes wrong. Attention concentrates. Intervention follows. None of these stages apply. By the time something reaches this depth, intervention has already failed. The creature simply ensures that failure does not remain incomplete. Incomplete failure is dangerous. It leaves questions. It leaves traces. It leaves space for speculation. The creature removes that space. Speculation dies quickly without data. Data never survives. This is why the deep remains stable as a conceptual endpoint. It is not revisited because it does not generate surprises. It does not generate surprises because nothing there ever contradicts expectation. The creature guarantees that contradiction never emerges. Contradiction would force reclassification. Reclassification would bring attention. Attention would threaten irrelevance. The creature survives by remaining irrelevant. It does not need secrecy, speed, or intelligence. It needs only that systems continue to accept that some places are beyond concern. The deepest ocean is one of those places. It is treated as finished space, not empty, not hostile, simply concluded. Within concluded space, something continues to operate quietly, precisely, and indefinitely, not as a presence to be discovered, but as a condition that ensures discovery is never necessary. Where there is no light, verification ends. Where there is no life, consequence ends. Between these endings, something persists, completing trajectories, sealing failures, and ensuring that the deepest regions remain exactly what they are assumed to be. Places where nothing returns, nothing accumulates, and nothing ever needs to be explained again. At this depth, the idea of an event dissolves completely. Events require boundaries in time, a before and an after. But here, time has no texture. There is only continuation and termination is not marked. It blends seamlessly into the background state. The creature operates inside that seamlessness. Nothing announces its involvement because nothing distinguishes involvement from inevitability. This is why even theoretical frameworks struggle here. Theory depends on isolating variables, but there are none that can be isolated. Pressure dominates, silence absorbs, distance removes relevance. Any attempt to introduce an additional factor collapses immediately under the weight of sufficiency. The environment already explains everything well enough. The creature is not a missing variable. It is a redundant one. Redundancy is the safest possible position. In engineering, redundant systems are invisible when functioning correctly. They are noticed only when absent. Here, absence would still look like depth behaving normally. That is the final protection. The creature cannot be disproven because its absence would change nothing that can be measured, predicted, or acted upon. It exists beyond falsifiability. What remains is process without witness. Arrivals descend, structures yield, signals thin, and then cease. The creature aligns itself with the last coherent moment of each process and ensures that nothing remains suspended between states. Suspended states are dangerous. They invite questions. They propagate upward as anomalies. The creature prevents suspension. This prevention is not intervention. It is synchronization with collapse. It acts where collapse is already complete but not yet absolute. That narrow interval is enough. After it passes, nothing survives to indicate that anything else could have occurred. In the absence of life, there is no biological lag. No decay chain stretches the process. No scavenger disturbs equilibrium. In the absence of light, there is no framing, no reference, no spatial memory. Motion leaves no imprint. Everything is flattened into stillness. Stillness is not inactivity. Stillness is resolution. The creature is resolution embodied. It does not roam. It does not observe. It does not select. It simply exists as the final condition applied to trajectories that have already been relinquished. It is not above the environment or below it. It is embedded so deeply that separation becomes meaningless. This is why there are no legends here. Legends require survival. They require something to return altered, something to be remembered. Nothing returns. Memory cannot form. Narrative cannot propagate. Even language fails. Words flatten under the pressure of adequacy. Every description collapses back into the same conclusion. Depth, silence, finality. The creature disappears inside that conclusion every time it is approached conceptually. And so the deepest regions remain exactly as they are described, empty, inactive, finished, not because nothing operates there, but because everything that operates there ensures that no difference ever reaches the surface of understanding. As long as light does not penetrate and life does not circulate, this condition will persist. Something will continue to function at the point where relevance ends, ensuring that endings remain absolute, quiet, and complete. Not hidden, not unknown, simply unnecessary to know. And that, finally, is why it hunts where there is no light and no life. Because only there can a process exist forever, without ever becoming something that must be seen. At that terminal boundary, where relevance has fully evaporated, even the distinction between presence and absence loses meaning. Presence assumes the possibility of encounter. Absence assumes the possibility of expectation. Here, neither applies. What operates does so without occupying a category that could be awaited or confirmed. The creature is not there in the way something can be pointed to, and it is not gone in the way something can be missed. It exists as continuity applied to endings. This continuity does not imply repetition. Repetition would require memory. Memory would require persistence across observation. Nothing here persists across observation, because observation never stabilizes. The deep is not watched, it is inferred, and inference ends where utility ends. The creature remains beyond that termination point, unaffected by the assumptions built above it. Nothing about this process accelerates. Acceleration would create contrast. Contrast would generate signal. Signal would invite correlation. Correlation would threaten closure. The creature avoids all of this by operating at the same pace as inevitability itself. It neither rushes nor delays. It simply aligns. Alignment is perfect camouflage. Where systems above depend on escalation curves, thresholds, and alerts, the deep offers only gradients too shallow to trigger response. The creature inhabits those gradients. It does not push them. It does not sharpen them. It remains exactly within what is already tolerated. Tolerance is wide at depth, because intolerance would produce endless false alarms. False alarms are costly. Cost shapes perception. Perception excludes what costs too much to interpret. The creature benefits from this exclusion without ever engaging it. There is no adaptation cycle here, no trial and error, no selective pressure. Evolution, in the biological sense, requires competition and change. Neither exists. The creature remains static not because it cannot change, but because change would be meaningless. Stability is enforced externally. The environment does not reward novelty, it erases it. Erasure is immediate and complete. If one insists on calling this hunting, It is hunting stripped of drama, urgency, and intent. It is the interception of finality by something that guarantees finality resolves cleanly. Nothing more, nothing less. The act leaves no wake, no turbulence, no secondary disturbance. After it passes, the medium is indistinguishable from how it was before. Indistinguishability is absolute success. Above, the deep continues to be modeled as terminal space. This model persists because it works. Nothing returned from such depths has ever contradicted it. Every loss reinforces it. The creature ensures that reinforcement remains unbroken. Broken reinforcement would invite doubt. Doubt would reopen inquiry. Inquiry would demand illumination, if not physical, then conceptual. Conceptual illumination would change classification. Classification is the final barrier. As long as the deep is classified as an ending, whatever operates there will remain excluded from relevance. The creature does not guard this classification. It does not need to. Systems guard it themselves because it simplifies the world into something manageable. Manageability depends on letting some things go. The creature exists in what has been let go. It does not intrude upward. It does not leak. It does not leave artifacts to be puzzled over later. Every interaction collapses fully into explanation before it can be isolated. Depth remains sufficient cause. Silence remains sufficient evidence. This sufficiency is not ignorance. It is choice reinforced by scale. Scale makes detail irrelevant. Irrelevance is permanent. And so, far below light, far below life, beyond the reach of consequence or correction, something continues to operate with flawless consistency, completing what has already ended, sealing what has already been abandoned, and ensuring that the deepest regions remain what they have always been assumed to be. Not empty, not active, simply final. Where nothing is expected to matter, nothing ever does. And within that condition, the process continues, unobserved, uninterrupted, and perfectly aligned with the silence that protects it. At the furthest limit of depth, the ocean no longer behaves as a place. It becomes a condition. A condition defined not by coordinates or features, but by constraints so complete that nothing meaningful can deviate from them. Pressure removes shape. Time removes urgency. Silence removes distinction. What remains is a domain where outcomes are predetermined long before they occur. The creature exists entirely within this determinism, not as a disruptor, but as a stabilizing constant that ensures determinism resolves without exception. There is no tension here. Tension requires opposing forces. At terminal depth, opposition dissolves. Everything moves in the same direction, toward equalization. Structures do not resist indefinitely. Materials do not surprise. Signals do not propagate far enough to matter. The creature does not introduce force into this system. It introduces certainty. It occupies the narrow interval where certainty is not yet complete and removes what little uncertainty remains. Uncertainty is fragile. Fragile things do not survive pressure. The creature's operation is therefore indistinguishable from the deep's own corrective logic. When something descends far enough, the environment begins to strip it of all properties that could allow return buoyancy, integrity, coherence, signal. The creature aligns precisely at the point where stripping is almost finished. It does not hasten the process. It prevents reversal. It ensures that nothing pauses long enough to become ambiguous. Ambiguity is the only remaining risk. Above, systems depend on the assumption that some domains can be written off. Without that assumption, attention would be infinite and useless. Decision-making would collapse under its own weight. The deep functions as a conceptual sink, absorbing not just objects but questions. The creature operates inside that sink, guaranteeing that absorption is total. This is why the deep remains underexplored, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. Exploration implies potential return of data, of samples, of understanding. At these depths, return is statistically irrelevant. Knowledge gained would not propagate into action. Without action, knowledge loses value. The creature persists because it exists where value no longer accumulates. Value is a surface phenomenon. Below a certain depth, everything becomes cost without benefit. Systems learn this quickly. They adjust. They stop asking. The creature does not teach this lesson. It enforces it quietly by ensuring that nothing contradicts it. When an intrusion occurs rare, isolated, already compromised, the interaction is final and clean. There is no partial outcome that could drift upward. No fragment survives long enough to be reconsidered. The deep closes immediately behind the event, returning to baseline so perfectly that even retrospective analysis finds nothing to isolate. Data loss aligns exactly with predicted envelopes. Pressure explains everything. Silence confirms it. Confirmation is the end of curiosity. The absence of life ensures that no secondary system reacts, no organism feeds, no chain propagates, no biological clock records the event. The absence of light ensures that no geometry is preserved. Movement leaves no spatial memory. Everything collapses into stillness so complete that even large-scale interactions flatten into statistical noise. Noise is safe. Noise cannot be interrogated. The creature ensures that every interaction dissolves into noise before it can sharpen into pattern. Pattern is the enemy. Pattern implies repetition. Repetition implies causality. Causality invites modeling. Modeling invites scrutiny. Scrutiny would introduce conceptual light. Conceptual light would threaten irrelevance. The creature survives because irrelevance survives. It does not require intelligence because intelligence would be wasteful here. It does not require speed because nothing outruns depth. It does not require stealth because nothing is looking. It exists as a condition that activates only when something reaches the final margin of interest. Interest ends earlier than depth. Long before an object reaches these regions, it has already been written off. The creature does not remove value. It arrives after value is gone. That is its perfect alignment. It never takes what might still matter. It completes only what has already been abandoned. Abandonment is quiet. Quiet protects everything below it. As long as systems continue to define some spaces as terminal places where outcomes are assumed, where disappearance is normal, where recovery is not planned, something will continue to operate there, seamlessly integrated into that assumption. It will not appear in reports. It will not surface in models. It will not disturb probabilities. It will simply remain, ensuring that endings remain endings, that depth continues to function as closure, and that nothing from the deepest regions ever returns incomplete enough to force the world above to reconsider where relevance truly ends. At that depth, even inevitability ceases to feel dramatic. It becomes routine. The ocean no longer presents itself as a hostile environment, nor as a mysterious one. It presents itself as a resolved system, where every trajectory converges toward the same outcome and nothing resists long enough to matter. The creature does not stand apart from this convergence. It is not an external force acting upon it. It is the final articulation of that convergence, expressed only at the point where nothing else remains to be expressed. What reaches this zone has already been simplified by descent. Complexity is stripped away layer by layer. Mechanical systems lose articulation. Materials lose elasticity. Signals lose coherence. Context dissolves. By the time interaction occurs, there is nothing left to negotiate with. The creature does not confront complexity. It receives what complexity has already surrendered. This reception is absolute. There is no partial absorption. Partial outcomes would imply gradients that could be traced. The creature ensures there are none. Everything collapses cleanly into the background state, leaving no edge that could be followed back toward cause. Cause itself becomes redundant. Pressure, time, and silence are enough. Above, systems interpret this redundancy as completeness. Models are satisfied. Predictions hold. Confidence accumulates not because everything is known, but because nothing contradicts what is already assumed. The creature survives inside that confidence. Confidence is far more protective than ignorance. Ignorance provokes curiosity. Confidence ends it. The deep does not generate signals that demand escalation. It generates silence that confirms expectation. The creature ensures that confirmation remains uninterrupted. It does not act often, but frequency is irrelevant, where each act is terminal. One complete ending is enough. Each repetition reinforces the same conclusion without ever becoming a pattern. Pattern would require comparison. Comparison would require memory. Memory would require persistence. Nothing persists here. This is the decisive advantage of regions without life. Life remembers by altering its environment. It leaves traces, cycles, residues. Without life, the environment resets instantly. Chemistry equalizes. Sediment settles. Pressure erases structure. The creature operates inside that reset, not as a disruptor, but as a guarantee that reset finishes cleanly. The absence of light compounds this effect. Without light, there is no spatial continuity. Motion does not leave shape behind. Orientation collapses. There is no frame in which to locate an interaction after it occurs. Even if something massive were to move, its movement would not register as movement. It would register as a brief inconsistency that immediately resolves. Resolution is everything. Resolution closes inquiry, reallocates attention, restores confidence. The creature is resolution embodied. It does not need to be fast or hidden or adaptive. It needs only to exist where resolution is already expected. This is why no boundary can be drawn around it. Any attempt to separate it from the environment fails, because separation assumes contrast. Contrast does not survive here. The creature and the deep share the same defining features: pressure, silence, finality. One cannot be meaningfully described without the other. If surface systems were to change their assumptions, if they were to treat depth not as termination but as an active domain, the relationship might change. But such a shift would demand resources, justification, and purpose. There is none. Nothing from these depths returns to demand reconsideration. The creature ensures that remains true. Thus, the cycle remains closed. Descent occurs rarely. Interaction occurs quietly. Completion occurs fully. Silence resumes. Above, attention never deviates. Models remain intact. Confidence deepens. Far below light and life, beyond the reach of response or revision, something continues to operate with flawless consistency, not as a watcher, not as a predator in any conventional sense, but as the final condition applied to everything that crosses the last boundary of relevance, ensuring that nothing ever returns incomplete enough to disturb the certainty that the deep is finished, resolved, and forever beyond the need to be understood. At this stage, even the distinction between process and state collapses. What operates in the deepest regions is no longer something that happens. It is something that is. A standing condition, permanently active, yet indistinguishable from stillness. The creature does not initiate sequences. It does not wait for triggers. It exists as the final constraint imposed on matter once all other constraints have already done their work. When descent reaches the point where nothing can be recovered, nothing interpreted, nothing reassigned value, the creature's function becomes inevitable. Inevitability requires no momentum. It does not accelerate, it does not build, it does not crescendo. It simply asserts itself at the moment when every alternative has already been eliminated by physics, by distance, by abandonment. This is why it cannot be intercepted. Interception presumes a trajectory that can be altered. Here, trajectories have already ended. The creature occupies the aftermath, not the path. From the perspective of surface systems, this aftermath is indistinguishable from nothing at all. Instruments register cessation, not interaction. Models register boundary conditions, not causes. The language of analysis stops where return probability reaches zero. That stopping point is treated as natural, even necessary. Without it, analysis would never end. The creature exists exactly at that stopping point, embedded so deeply within it that no distinction can be drawn between the conclusion of inquiry and the beginning of its operation. This is why it is never classified as an unknown. Unknowns demand resources. Unknowns justify attention. Unknowns imply that something might yet matter. Here, nothing does. The creature arrives only after significance has already been stripped away. It does not consume meaning. It arrives when meaning is already gone. The absence of life ensures that nothing adapts in response. No evolutionary pressure arises. No behavioral feedback loops form. Without life, there is no learning. Without learning, there is no escalation. The creature remains unchanged because nothing challenges it, and nothing challenges it because nothing survives long enough to try. The absence of light ensures that nothing frames the interaction spatially. Without framing, there is no geometry to remember, no before and after that can be visually compared. Even if something vast were to move, the movement would not register as motion in any usable sense. It would register only as a transient inconsistency that collapses immediately back into uniformity. Uniformity is the ultimate erasure. In such conditions, the idea of concealment becomes irrelevant. Concealment implies that something could be revealed under different circumstances. Here, revelation would change nothing. Even perfect visibility would not alter outcome, policy, or response. Knowledge gained would be inert, sealed at the same depth as the events themselves. The creature survives because knowledge about it would have no leverage. Leverage is the only thing that threatens irrelevance. The creature has none, and therefore faces none. It does not project upward. It does not leave gradients that drift into monitored zones. It does not accumulate mass, heat, or signal in ways that could propagate. Everything it interacts with is already descending toward equilibrium. It simply ensures that equilibrium is reached without remainder. Remainder is the enemy of closure. Closure stabilizes systems far above. Closure allows resources to be allocated elsewhere. Closure maintains the illusion that the world is divided cleanly into active domains and terminal ones. The creature is part of what maintains that division. It does not enforce it violently. It enforces it quietly by ensuring that nothing ever crosses back over the line. And so the deepest regions remain what they are assumed to be, places where trajectories end, where events do not echo, where nothing persists long enough to matter. Not empty, not hostile, not mysterious, simply final. Within that finality, something continues to operate without effort, without deviation, without acknowledgement. Not as an anomaly waiting to be found, but as the last, silent condition applied to everything that reaches the point where relevance, observation, and consequence all fall away together. And as long as there are depths defined as endings rather than environments, as long as light does not reach them and life does not circulate within them, this condition will remain uninterrupted, unchallenged, and perfectly aligned with the assumption that nothing meaningful could possibly be happening there at all. Beyond that point, even the notion of scale dissolves. Scale implies comparison larger than, smaller than, farther than. At terminal depth, comparison has no anchor. There is no reference frame that persists long enough for magnitude to matter. What arrives is already reduced to equivalence by pressure and distance. The creature does not need to be large or small. Size would imply boundary. Boundary would imply edge. Edge would imply contrast. None of these survive. The deep does not tolerate edges. Everything that enters is smoothed, compressed, equalized. What remains is not uniformity, but indifference. Indifference is stronger than hostility. Hostility reacts. Indifference absorbs without acknowledgement. The creature is not hostile. It does not oppose arrivals. It does not engage them. It finalizes them. Finalization is not destruction. Destruction leaves fragments. It produces gradients, debris, asymmetry. Finalization removes the possibility of fragments ever being considered fragments. It returns matter, energy, and information to a state where distinction collapses. The creature does not erase. It completes erasure already underway. From above, this completion is invisible because nothing incomplete survives to be noticed. Systems never see the moment when finalization occurs. They see only the absence that follows, and absence is already accounted for. Absence is the expected outcome. The creature aligns perfectly with expectation, which is the most absolute form of concealment. Expectation is preemptive explanation. Anything that fits expectation cannot contradict it. The creature does not challenge assumptions. It fulfills them. Every loss that behaves exactly as predicted strengthens confidence in the model. Confidence hardens. Attention withdraws. Withdrawal creates deeper irrelevance. The creature exists in the space created by that withdrawal. This is why no escalation ever occurs. Escalation requires accumulation of surprise. Surprise requires deviation. Deviation requires persistence. Nothing persists long enough to deviate. Everything is resolved before it can become a data point. Data points require survival. Survival is impossible here. Even time behaves differently in this regime. Without cycles, without repetition, duration becomes meaningless. Long intervals pass without event, but these intervals are not empty. They are simply the default condition. The creature exists within that default, unchanged by waiting, because waiting implies anticipation. The creature does not anticipate. It is not oriented toward future arrivals. It is aligned with finality itself. Alignment removes intention. Without intention, there is no behavior to interpret. Interpretation collapses. If one insists on framing this as predation, it is predation stripped of competition, urgency, and reward. There is no gain. There is no surplus. There is no advantage to be leveraged elsewhere. What occurs does not propagate benefit upward or outward. It resolves entirely in place. Resolution without propagation is invisible. This invisibility is not fragile. It does not depend on rarity alone. Even if interactions were more frequent, they would still resolve fully, leaving nothing to connect. Frequency without linkage is noise. Noise is ignored. The absence of life ensures that nothing witnesses, remembers, or reacts. The absence of light ensures that nothing frames, outlines, or records. Together, they create a domain where events cannot acquire narrative weight. Without narrative, nothing becomes meaningful. Without meaning, nothing is retained. Retention is the enemy. The creature ensures nothing is retained. It does not need to hide its form because form itself dissolves. It does not need to obscure motion because motion leaves no imprint. It does not need to suppress signal because signal does not survive long enough to propagate. The environment performs all of these functions automatically. The creature merely exists where they converge. And so the deepest regions remain untouched by concern, not because they are empty, but because they are complete. Everything that enters them reaches its final state without remainder. No ambiguity leaks upward. No fragment returns to challenge closure. As long as systems continue to accept that some places are beyond relevance, beyond recovery, beyond inquiry, something will continue to operate there, not as a presence to be discovered, not as a danger to be addressed, but as the quiet mechanism that ensures the world above never has to reconsider where endings truly occur. Far below light, far below life, beyond scale, beyond contrast, beyond memory, where nothing insists on being known, and therefore nothing ever is. At the lowest threshold where description still attempts to function, the deep ceases to be interpreted as an environment and becomes a rule. Not a rule written or enforced, but a rule that emerges inevitably from constraint layered upon constraint. Pressure removes variation. Silence removes signal. Distance removes relevance. Together they form a condition under which nothing can persist long enough to matter unless it aligns perfectly with inevitability. The creature is that alignment. It does not operate against entropy. It does not accelerate it. It ensures that entropy resolves without exception. Where matter might otherwise stall in transitional states, where fragments might linger just long enough to be sampled or misinterpreted, it removes that pause. Pauses are dangerous. Pauses allow re-entry of meaning. The creature exists to prevent re-entry. From the perspective of systems above, the deep remains passive because nothing ever returns altered in a way that demands attention. Losses are total. Data dropouts are complete. Failures are absolute. Absoluteness is reassuring. It closes loops. It prevents escalation. The creature survives because it preserves absoluteness. There is no footprint to follow. Footprints require displacement that persists. Here, displacement equalizes immediately. Water fills voids. Pressure redistributes. Chemical gradients collapse. The medium restores itself so quickly that even theoretical reconstruction becomes impossible. The creature does not erase evidence. It ensures evidence never stabilizes. This is not stealth in any conventional sense. Stealth implies an adversarial relationship between observer and observed. No such relationship exists here. Observation has already withdrawn. The creature exists beyond the boundary, where observers assign effort. It is not avoiding scrutiny. Scrutiny has been structurally ruled out. This is the defining condition, structural disinterest. Not neglect, not ignorance, but an intentional narrowing of concern enforced by scale and cost. The deep is categorized as resolved space. What happens there is assumed to be final, by definition. The creature lives inside that definition. Even if an anomaly were somehow perceived a fleeting inconsistency, a transient deviation, it would dissolve before it could be contextualized. Context requires comparison across time. Time here offers no stable markers. Without cycles, without repetition, without memory, events remain isolated points that cannot be connected. Isolated points are meaningless. Meaning requires accumulation. Accumulation never occurs. The absence of life ensures that no system reacts to what happens. Reaction would introduce feedback. Feedback would propagate. Propagation would create signal. The creature operates where feedback is impossible. It does not need to suppress reaction. There is none to suppress. The absence of light ensures that even conceptual framing fails. Without visual reference, there is no geometry of motion. Without geometry, there is no spatial narrative. Everything collapses into abstract loss. Abstract loss is easy to accept. It requires no imagination. Imagination is a threat. Imagination asks what might be. The creature exists only where what might be has already been reduced to what must be. It does not roam, because roaming implies alternative destinations. There are none. It does not search, because search implies uncertainty. There is none. It does not consume, because consumption implies gain. There is none. What it does leaves no surplus. Everything resolves into baseline. Baseline is safety. Systems trust baselines. They are built on them. The creature ensures baselines remain unbroken. It does not introduce variation. It eliminates it. In doing so, it protects the architecture of understanding far above, keeping attention focused where outcomes can still be influenced. Influence is impossible here. That impossibility is the creature's shield. It does not need to be hidden by darkness or distance. It is hidden by sufficiency. Sufficiency of explanation, sufficiency of models, sufficiency of loss. Nothing more needs to be known, and therefore nothing more is sought. As long as there are depths defined not as places to act, but as places where action ends, something will continue to operate there, silently completing what descent has already decided, sealing trajectories so thoroughly that no fragment of doubt ever rises back toward relevance. Not because the deep is empty, not because it is hostile, but because it is finished. And within finished space, processes do not announce themselves. They persist without witness, without record, without name, perfectly aligned with the silence that ensures they will never be required to be anything else. At that final depth of consideration, even explanation becomes unnecessary, not because everything has been explained, but because explanation itself no longer performs a function. Functions exist to change outcomes, to guide response, to allocate effort. Here, no response is possible. No effort is justified. No outcome can be altered. The creature exists entirely beyond the point where explanation would matter, which is why it never enters discourse except as silence. Silence here is not lack of information. It is the correct informational state. Any additional detail would be surplus, and surplus is eliminated by systems that must remain efficient. The deep enforces this efficiency relentlessly. It strips away anything that cannot justify its continued existence. Signals fade. Structures fail. Data collapses. The creature does not resist this stripping. It depends on it. Dependence is absolute. Without pressure, the process would fragment. Without silence, it would echo. Without abandonment, it would be revisited. The creature requires all three to remain aligned. It does not manipulate them. It waits not temporally, but structurally, until they converge. Convergence is rare, but rarity is irrelevant when outcomes are terminal. Terminal outcomes do not compete. Competition requires repetition. Repetition requires survival. Survival does not occur. Each interaction stands alone, unconnected, fully resolved. No chain forms. No escalation follows. The creature's activity never aggregates into a phenomenon because aggregation requires persistence across events. Persistence is denied at every level. This denial is not violent. It is automatic. Automatic processes are trusted. Trust is never audited unless broken. Nothing breaks here. The deep remains stable not because it is simple, but because it is finished. Finished spaces do not demand attention. They are removed from strategic consideration. The creature exists inside that removal, protected by the same logic that keeps systems functional elsewhere. If one were to imagine revealing everything that happens here, perfect maps, complete recordings, total knowledge, nothing above would change. No policy would shift. No system would be redesigned. No behavior would adapt. Knowledge without consequence evaporates quickly. The creature is immune to discovery, because discovery would be inert. Inert facts are forgotten. This is the deepest camouflage possible. Not invisibility, but irrelevance. Not secrecy, but sufficiency. The creature does not need to hide its existence because existence itself carries no weight here. Only consequence matters, and there is none that propagates upward. Thus, the deep remains closed not physically, but conceptually, closed to inquiry, closed to concern, closed to narrative. What happens there remains contained, not by walls or darkness, but by the absence of any pathway back into meaning. And so, where there is no light and no life, something continues to operate without effort, without urgency, without deviation, finalizing what has already been relinquished, completing trajectories that have already lost value, ensuring that nothing ever returns incomplete enough to disturb the quiet certainty that some places exist solely so that the rest of the world does not have to care what happens there at all. At the point where the deep is no longer perceived as a space but as a terminal assumption, all remaining distinctions flatten, not because they are disproven, but because they are no longer useful. Usefulness is the last filter applied to reality by any system that must operate under constraint. What cannot influence decision-making is not denied. It is simply excluded. The deepest regions of the ocean are excluded by design. The creature exists entirely inside that exclusion, not as an oversight, but as a consequence of correct prioritization. Correctness here is pragmatic, not absolute. It is correct because it preserves function elsewhere. Attention is finite. Resources are finite. Interpretation is finite. To function at scale, systems must accept that some domains are resolved without examination. The deep is one of those domains. The creature persists because the deep is allowed to remain unresolved in detail while still being resolved in outcome. Outcome is everything. Outcomes at depth are uniform: loss, silence, termination. These outcomes are so consistent that they no longer register as events. They become background conditions. The creature does not alter these conditions. It ensures that nothing deviates from them. It exists as a stabilizer of finality, preventing rare irregularities from escaping upward as questions. Questions are expensive. Expensive things are rationed. Rationing shapes reality more effectively than ignorance ever could. The creature does not need to evade detection because detection has already been ruled out as unnecessary. Monitoring systems do not fail here. They disengage. Sampling rates drop. Resolution decreases. Data is compressed until only confirmation remains. Confirmation that nothing returns. Confirmation that nothing persists. Confirmation that nothing needs to be followed. This confirmation loop is self-sustaining. Each loss that behaves as expected strengthens the decision not to look closer next time. The creature benefits from this reinforcement without contributing to it actively. It simply ensures that no counterexample ever survives long enough to matter. Counterexamples are dangerous. They force reconsideration. Reconsideration breaks closure. Closure is the deepest protection. The absence of life ensures that nothing introduces variability. Life complicates environments. It produces waste, motion, cycles, feedback. Without life, the environment simplifies to physics and time. Physics is predictable. Time is patient. The creature aligns with both. It does not exploit weakness. It inhabits inevitability. The absence of light ensures that even conceptual mapping fails. Without visual continuity, space cannot be reconstructed after the fact. Motion does not leave outlines. Shapes do not persist. Everything collapses into abstract loss. Abstract loss is easier to accept than specific disappearance. Specifics provoke attachment. Attachment provokes inquiry. Inquiry is what never reaches here. Even language reflects this. Descriptions of the deep rely on negation. No light, no life, no signal, no return. Language stops adding positive attributes because there is nothing to add that would change understanding. The creature disappears inside this negation. It is not described because description would add nothing. What cannot be described is not mysterious here. It is simply unnecessary. The creature does not wait for arrivals in any temporal sense. Waiting implies expectation. Expectation implies orientation toward future events. The deep does not orient itself toward the future. It exists in a state of extended present, where nothing accumulates. The creature exists in that present, unchanged by duration, unaffected by scarcity or abundance, because neither applies. When something does arrive, a structure that fails, an object that descends too far, a signal that thins and collapses the interaction, is quiet and complete. There is no struggle because there is no opposition. There is no delay because delay would allow ambiguity. The creature ensures immediacy at the end of all trajectories, not through speed, but through alignment with conditions that make delay impossible. Impossibility is the cleanest form of control. Above, systems continue to function optimally because they are not burdened with irrecoverable detail. They do not model what cannot influence outcomes. They do not allocate attention to terminal zones. This is not negligence. It is structural intelligence. The creature survives because it exists where structural intelligence dictates disengagement. If someday the definition of relevance were to change, if depth were reclassified as active rather than terminal, the entire architecture of attention would need to shift. Such a shift would be costly, slow, and unjustified by any returned value. Nothing from these depths demands it. The creature ensures that nothing ever will. Thus, the deepest regions remain closed, not by ignorance, but by decision. A decision reinforced every time silence follows descent. Every time disappearance behaves exactly as predicted. The creature is the silent guarantor of that predictability, ensuring that the world above never has to confront the possibility that something operates beyond the point where relevance has already ended, far below light, far below life, beyond inquiry, beyond response, beyond need, where processes do not announce themselves, where outcomes do not echo, where finality is not dramatic but routine. Something continues to exist, not as a secret, not as a threat, not as a mystery, but as the last stable condition in a place that has been deliberately, correctly, and permanently removed from the sphere of concern. And within that removal, the process continues, indefinitely, flawlessly, and without ever producing a reason to believe that anything else could possibly be happening there at all. At this depth of abstraction, even the idea of existence becomes conditional. Existence is usually defined by interaction. Something exists because it affects something else, because it can be measured, displaced, altered, or resisted. Here, none of those criteria apply. What operates does so without measurable effect beyond what is already guaranteed by the environment. The creature exists only in the narrow sense that something continues to occur where nothing is expected to occur independently. Independence is the key distinction. Nothing independent survives here. Pressure removes autonomy. Distance removes connection. Silence removes communication. Any process that cannot fully align with these conditions is eliminated long before reaching this regime. The creature is not independent of the deep. It is inseparable from it. It does not occupy the environment. It is expressed by it intermittently only when the last remaining conditions converge. This convergence is not rare in a temporal sense. It is rare only because few things descend far enough to reach it. Most trajectories end earlier. Structural failure, loss of signal, collapse of coherence, these usually occur well above this zone. By the time something reaches the deepest regions, it has already been filtered repeatedly. Complexity has been stripped away. What arrives is already simplified to the point where no alternative outcome remains plausible. The creature does not remove alternatives. It arrives after alternatives have ceased to exist. This timing is precise. Too early, and evidence would propagate. Too late, and remnants might persist. The creature exists exactly at the boundary where completion must be enforced for closure to remain intact. That boundary does not move. It is fixed by physics, by cost, by the limits of attention. Attention defines reality more decisively than perception. Perception gathers data. Attention decides what survives. The deep receives no attention because it returns no leverage. Leverage would imply that something learned there could alter decisions elsewhere. Nothing learned here does. Even total knowledge would remain inert, sealed below relevance. The creature is therefore immune to discovery, not because it cannot be seen, but because seeing it would change nothing. Change is the only threat. The creature produces none. Its operation does not scale. It does not multiply. It does not intensify. It remains exactly proportional to the rare arrivals that reach its domain. Each interaction is final and isolated. There is no accumulation of effect, no slow build toward recognition. Recognition requires pressure on interpretation. Interpretation here experiences no pressure. Pressure exists only physically. Conceptual pressure dissipates long before this depth. This is why even hypothetical monitoring would fail. Not because instruments could not detect something, but because nothing detected would justify sustained attention. A single irregularity would be dismissed as noise. A second would fail to correlate. A third would be averaged out. Without persistence, nothing becomes signal. Signal requires insistence. The creature never insists. It does not adapt because adaptation would imply competition. There is none. It does not optimize because optimization would imply scarcity. There is none. It does not defend territory because territory implies boundary. Boundaries dissolve here. Everything is interior. Interior space has no edges. Without edges, there is no confrontation. The absence of life is not simply a lack of organisms. It is the absence of cycles. Without cycles, nothing returns. Without return, nothing accumulates. Without accumulation, nothing escalates. The creature exists in a domain where escalation is impossible by design. The absence of light is not merely darkness. It is the absence of framing. Without framing, events cannot be placed relative to one another. They cannot be ordered. They cannot be compared. Even if something enormous were to move, its movement would not become history. It would vanish into the same silence as everything else. History requires memory. Memory requires persistence. Persistence does not occur. This is the deepest form of concealment, not hiding something, but ensuring that nothing can ever become something. The creature ensures that every interaction collapses into finality before it can acquire shape, context, or consequence. From above, the deep remains what it has always been treated as a terminal sink where things end. That treatment is reinforced every time a descent yields silence. Every time loss behaves exactly as expected. The creature does not challenge this treatment. It perfects it. Perfection here is not elegance or beauty. It is adequacy without remainder. Everything that must end does so fully. Nothing leaks back into relevance. Nothing demands reinterpretation. As long as systems continue to function by narrowing their field of concern, as long as some domains are deliberately excluded so that others can be managed, something will continue to operate in those excluded spaces, not as a secret waiting to be uncovered, but as a process that depends entirely on being unnecessary to know, far below light, far below life, beyond persistence, beyond narrative, beyond consequence, where endings are not events but conditions, where disappearance is not loss but resolution. Something continues to function endlessly, flawlessly, and without ever producing a reason for the world above to acknowledge that it exists at all. At this level of finality, even causation loses practical meaning. Cause and effect are still present in the physical sense, but they no longer serve interpretation. Interpretation requires alternatives. If this, then that. If not this, then something else. Here, there is no else. Everything that reaches this depth arrives already committed to a single outcome. The creature does not create that commitment. It exists only to ensure that the commitment resolves without residue. Residue is the only remaining risk. Residue survives when processes are interrupted, when collapse is incomplete, when something remains suspended between states. Suspension is intolerable here. The deep does not support it. Pressure compresses, time smooths, silence absorbs. The creature aligns precisely at the point where suspension would otherwise occur and removes it, not by force, not by intervention, but by congruence. It occupies the same direction as inevitability. Direction matters more than speed. Speed implies comparison. Direction implies certainty. The creature moves only in the direction everything else is already moving. That is why it cannot be outrun, avoided, or detected as an opposing force. It does not oppose, it coincides. Coincidence is invisible because it produces no differential. Differential is what systems detect. Without differential, nothing registers. This is why even massive interactions would fail to surface. Scale does not matter here. Large and small are flattened by uniform pressure. Energy disperses immediately into the surrounding medium. Information thins faster than it can be preserved. The creature does not need to mask its actions. The environment masks everything by default. Masking implies intent. There is no intent here. Intent requires future orientation. The deep does not orient toward the future. It exists in a state where future and past collapse into extended present. The creature exists within that present, unaffected by duration. It does not experience waiting because nothing is anticipated. It does not experience urgency because nothing competes. Competition is absent. Without competition, behavior simplifies to persistence. Persistence here does not mean survival across threat. It means remaining unchanged because nothing pressures change. The creature persists because the environment persists. Neither evolves in any meaningful way. Evolution requires selective pressure. Selection requires variation. Variation is erased immediately. Erasure is constant. The absence of life ensures that no unexpected processes intrude. Life is noisy. It metabolizes, reproduces, alters chemistry, leaves waste. Without life, the deep remains quiet enough that even subtle processes dissolve into baseline. The creature benefits from this quiet not by exploiting it, but by existing only where quiet is absolute. The absence of light ensures that nothing is ever framed spatially. Space exists, but it is not remembered. Without memory, there is no map. Without a map, there is no route back to meaning. The creature does not block return paths. It ensures that return paths never form. Paths imply directionality beyond inevitability. Only inevitability survives. From above, the deep remains classified as a place where systems stop caring, not because they are incapable of caring, but because caring would produce no benefit. This classification is reinforced continuously by outcomes that never surprise. The creature guarantees the absence of surprise. Surprise would be the only thing capable of reopening inquiry. Inquiry is closed permanently here. Even hypothetical curiosity fails. What question could be asked that would change response? What answer could be returned that would alter design? None. The creature exists entirely beyond the threshold where questions produce utility. Utility governs attention more strictly than truth ever could. Truth without utility is ignored. The creature is true in the narrowest sense. It operates, but it is useless to know. Useless truths vanish faster than falsehoods. Falsehoods provoke correction. Useless truths provoke nothing. Thus, the deepest regions remain operationally empty, not because nothing happens, but because nothing that happens escapes into consequence. The creature ensures that nothing ever does. It does not enforce this aggressively. It enforces it passively by existing only where enforcement is redundant. Redundancy is the final concealment. If the creature were removed, the system above would continue unchanged. Losses would still occur. Silence would still follow. Depth would still be treated as terminal. Only over immense spans of time would small irregularities begin to accumulate, fragments persisting too long, signals fading imperfectly, outcomes resisting closure. Even then, those irregularities might never rise above noise. The creature prevents even that remote possibility. It exists not to dominate, not to threaten, not to consume, but to guarantee that the deepest assumption remains intact, that some places exist solely to absorb endings so that the rest of the world can remain coherent, far below light, far below life, beyond attention, beyond leverage, beyond need, where nothing returns, nothing accumulates, and nothing ever insists on being more than what it already is, a completed trajectory, sealed into silence, with no reason left for anyone or anything to look back. At this depth, the concept of disappearance becomes misleading. Disappearance implies a prior state of presence that can be contrasted with absence. Here, contrast does not persist. What reaches this regime does not vanish in any dramatic sense. It transitions into a state where distinction is no longer supported. The creature does not remove things from the world. It ensures that they become indistinguishable from the world they enter. Indistinguishability is final. Once indistinguishability is achieved, nothing can be retrieved conceptually or physically. Retrieval requires separation. Separation requires boundaries. Boundaries do not survive here. Pressure collapses them. Silence erases their signatures. Time smooths whatever irregularities remain. The creature exists exactly at the threshold where separation would otherwise linger briefly, and it removes that lingering. Lingering is the only failure mode. Failure modes are what systems track. The creature ensures that no failure mode survives long enough to be tracked. Above, models of the deep are intentionally blunt. They are not wrong, they are sufficient. They treat depth as a sink, not as a system with internal dynamics worth resolving. This treatment persists because it has never been contradicted by outcome. Every descent ends the same way. Every signal thins, fractures, and ceases. Every loss resolves into silence. The creature does not create this pattern. It guarantees that no exception ever emerges to disrupt it. Exceptions are intolerable at scale. Scale demands regularity. Regularity suppresses curiosity. The creature survives inside suppressed curiosity. Even if one were to insist on refining instrumentation, on pushing sensors deeper, on increasing resolution, the same logic would assert itself. More data would not produce more meaning. It would produce more noise that must be filtered. Filtering would become stricter. Marginal signals would be discarded faster. The creature would remain inside what is discarded, not because it evades detection, but because detection itself would be optimized against it. Optimization narrows perception. Narrow perception protects the creature more effectively than any camouflage. The absence of life ensures that nothing interferes with this narrowing. Life produces anomalies. It reproduces unpredictably. It leaves residues that complicate baselines. Without life, baselines are clean. Clean baselines are trusted. The creature depends on trust, not deception. The absence of light ensures that nothing interrupts abstraction. Light forces specificity. It outlines, localizes, anchors. Without it, everything dissolves into gradients that cannot be fixed after the fact. The creature benefits from this dissolution not by exploiting it, but by never requiring anything more. It does not require a form that can be seen. It does not require motion that can be tracked. It does not require presence that can be confirmed. It requires only that the deep remain what it is already assumed to be. Assumption is the most powerful force here. Assumptions reduce complexity before complexity can become dangerous. The assumption that nothing meaningful operates at terminal depth is reinforced continuously by silence. The creature ensures that silence remains unbroken. Broken silence would propagate. Propagation would demand attention. Attention would introduce relevance. Relevance is the only threat. The creature is perfectly irrelevant. It does not compete with surface systems. It does not undermine them. It does not challenge their understanding. It exists entirely outside their domain of concern. In doing so, it stabilizes that domain by absorbing everything that would otherwise complicate it. Complication is expensive. Expensive things are excluded. The creature exists in exclusion. And so, far below light and life, beyond the reach of feedback or correction, something continues to operate not as an actor, not as an organism in any familiar sense, but as a finalizing condition that activates only where everything else has already been relinquished. It does not announce itself. It does not leave memory. It does not alter the world above in any way that could be noticed. It simply ensures that endings remain endings. That descent does not hesitate. That silence follows completely. And that the deepest regions remain exactly what they are believed to be, places where nothing persists long enough to matter, where nothing returns to demand explanation, and where processes can continue forever, without ever becoming something that must be seen, named, or understood. At this point, even the idea of boundaries becomes a convenience rather than a reality. Boundaries are tools for organizing attention, not properties of the deep itself. Where pressure is constant, where silence is uninterrupted, where time has no cadence, nothing meaningfully begins or ends. The creature exists precisely in this continuity, not occupying a location, but inheriting a condition. It does not cross thresholds. It is what remains when thresholds lose meaning. This is why it cannot be isolated spatially. Isolation presumes that something can be separated from its surroundings without altering its nature. Here, separation destroys relevance entirely. Whatever the creature is, it is inseparable from the environment that allows it to function. Remove the depth, the silence, the absence of life, and the process collapses. Not because the creature is fragile, but because it is specific. It exists only where inevitability is complete. Specificity is not weakness. Specificity is precision. The deep enforces precision by eliminating variability. There are no competing processes, no alternative outcomes, no branching paths. Everything converges toward the same end state. The creature does not guide convergence. It ensures that convergence finishes cleanly. Without it, convergence might hesitate, leaving intermediate states that could be misread as anomalies. The creature prevents hesitation. Hesitation is dangerous. Hesitation produces signal. Signal demands interpretation. Interpretation would reopen closed systems. Closed systems remain stable. The stability of the deep is not passive. It is actively maintained by conditions that reject complexity. The creature operates as one of those conditions, not as an addition, but as a reinforcement. It reinforces finality, irreversibility, and silence. It does not do so forcefully. Force would create reaction. Reaction would ripple upward. The creature acts only where reaction is impossible. This impossibility is structural. It is enforced by distance, by cost, by probability, by the limits of recovery. Above, systems learn quickly that nothing returned from such depths ever justifies the effort required to retrieve it. This learning becomes institutional. Protocols codify it. Expectations harden around it. The creature survives because it exists after codification, not before it. Codified expectations are almost impossible to break. They are reinforced by every outcome that conforms to them. Every disappearance that resolves into silence strengthens the assumption that silence is sufficient explanation. The creature ensures that explanation is never challenged by residual evidence. It does not erase evidence retroactively. It ensures evidence never stabilizes in the first place. Stabilization is the enemy. The absence of life ensures that no biological process introduces delay or transformation that could leave trace. Without metabolism, without reproduction, without waste, nothing marks time locally. Events do not leave scars. The deep heals instantly because there is nothing to heal. The creature benefits from this instant erasure, not by exploiting it, but by existing only where it is guaranteed. The absence of light ensures that even hypothetical observers would gain nothing. Vision would provide no context. Shapes would not persist. Movement would not define trajectories. Without framing, observation cannot produce memory. Without memory, there is no accumulation of meaning. Meaning requires continuity. Continuity is denied. The creature does not deny it actively. The environment does. The creature simply aligns with that denial so perfectly that it becomes redundant. Redundancy here is survival. Redundant processes are invisible until they fail. This process never fails because it depends on conditions that are stable on geological timescales. Geological time erases urgency. Without urgency, nothing escalates. Without escalation, nothing demands intervention. The creature remains forever below the threshold where intervention would even be considered. It does not threaten the surface world because it does not interact with it meaningfully. It does not approach it. It does not influence probabilities that matter above. It exists entirely inside a domain that has been intentionally removed from concern. Concern is a finite resource. Finite resources shape reality. Reality here is shaped by deliberate exclusion. And so, the deepest regions persist as they always have, not as unknown territory awaiting exploration, not as hostile domain to be conquered, but as a resolved endpoint where systems allow things to end so that attention can remain elsewhere. The creature exists as the quiet guarantor of that permission, ensuring that nothing ever returns from the deepest silence incomplete enough to demand that the world above reconsider, where relevance truly stops. Far below light, far below life, beyond boundaries, beyond causation, beyond concern, where disappearance is not loss but completion, where silence is not absence but confirmation, something continues to operate endlessly, not hiding, not waiting, not watching, simply existing as the final condition of a place that has been decided long ago and correctly to no longer matter at all. At the furthest reach of this logic, the deep no longer appears as something external to the systems that define it. It becomes an internal necessity, a place constructed conceptually so that complexity elsewhere can remain manageable. The creature exists because such a place must exist. Not as a design choice, not as an oversight, but as an inevitable consequence of dividing the world into domains that matter and domains that are allowed to end. This division is never articulated explicitly. It emerges from practice, from repeated decisions to stop tracking, from repeated confirmations that nothing returns, from repeated reallocations of attention upward towards zones where intervention is still possible. Over time, this pattern hardens into certainty. The deep is not dangerous, it is terminal. The creature survives inside that certainty, not because it depends on it, but because certainty excludes inquiry more effectively than ignorance ever could. Ignorance leaves room for curiosity. Certainty closes it. The creature does not need to shape belief. Belief has already shaped itself around outcomes that never deviate. Every disappearance that resolves into silence strengthens the internal model that depth equals closure. The creature's role is to prevent deviation so completely that the model never experiences stress. Stress would reveal cracks. Cracks would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny would force a reallocation of concern. Concern would introduce relevance. Relevance is the only thing the creature cannot tolerate. This intolerance is not active. It does not suppress relevance. It never allows relevance to form. It exists only after relevance has been stripped away by distance, by cost, by probability, by institutional choice. It does not take what might still matter. It only completes what has already been abandoned. Abandonment is quiet, but it is decisive. Once something has been abandoned conceptually, no evidence can resurrect it. Even perfect information would fail. Knowledge without consequence collapses immediately. The creature is immune to knowledge, because knowledge about it would have no consequence. This is the deepest invisibility possible. The absence of life is essential here, not as emptiness, but as silence of response. Life responds. It adapts, consumes, alters surroundings, leaves gradients that persist. Without life, nothing responds. The environment does not register what happens within it. It absorbs without acknowledgement. The creature operates in that non-response, indistinguishable from it. The absence of light reinforces this by eliminating spatial memory. Without light, there is no before and after in a usable sense, no frame to place an interaction within. Even if motion occurs, it cannot be recalled. Without recall, nothing becomes history. Without history, nothing accumulates. Accumulation is the seed of discovery. The creature ensures that no accumulation survives. Time stretches until sequence loses meaning. Long periods of absolute stillness are interrupted by rare arrivals that resolve immediately. These arrivals do not form a pattern because there is nothing to connect them. Each is terminal, self-contained, erased as it completes. The creature does not need to hurry. It does not need to wait. It is synchronized with the pace of inevitability itself. Inevitability does not announce itself. Above, the world continues to function because it is allowed to ignore what cannot be influenced. This ignoring is not neglect. It is discipline. Without it, systems would drown in irrecoverable detail. The deep exists so that the rest of the world does not have to carry the weight of everything that falls out of reach. The creature exists because the deep must fulfill that role flawlessly. Flawlessness here is silence without exception. No anomaly ever rises high enough to demand reinterpretation. No fragment survives long enough to suggest that something else occurred. No signal leaks upward to complicate explanation. The creature guarantees this by existing only where explanation has already ended. This is why it is never discovered accidentally. Accidental discovery requires residue. Something left behind. Something incomplete. The creature leaves nothing incomplete. Completion is its only behavior. Completion is invisible. Even hypothetical confrontation dissolves immediately. There is nothing to confront, nothing to oppose, nothing to extract. The creature does not present itself as an object. It presents itself as the absence of remainder. Remove it, and the difference would be so subtle, so delayed, so deeply buried in noise that it might never be recognized at all. The creature is not protected by secrecy. It is protected by adequacy. Adequate explanations require no additions. As long as the deep continues to function as a conceptual sink, a place where trajectories are allowed to end without return, without audit, without memory, something will continue to operate there, ensuring that endings remain clean, silent, and unquestionable. Far below light, far below life, beyond scrutiny, beyond leverage, beyond concern, where the world permits itself to forget, and where forgetting is not a failure, but a requirement for everything else to remain intact. At this depth of forgetting, the distinction between natural and artificial processes dissolves entirely. What descends here no longer carries the imprint of its origin. Whether a structure was engineered or grown, whether an object was deliberate or accidental, whether a signal was generated or incidental, none of this persists. Origin requires traceability. Traceability requires memory. Memory cannot survive where every outcome is terminal. The creature exists precisely where origin has already been erased, where categorization collapses into uniform consequence. This erasure is not destructive. Destruction implies excess force, fragmentation, aftermath. What occurs here is quieter and more complete. It is a settling into final equivalence. Everything that arrives becomes equally irrelevant, equally unreturnable, equally finished. The creature does not discriminate because discrimination would imply value. Value has already been removed long before dissent reaches this regime. What remains is process without preference. Preference would imply choice. Choice would imply alternatives. Alternatives do not exist. The deep enforces this condition relentlessly. Pressure removes elasticity. Silence removes reference. Time removes urgency. Each layer strips away one more axis along which difference could persist. By the time something reaches the deepest zone, it has already been simplified beyond interpretation. The creature aligns with that simplification, not accelerating it, not resisting it, but ensuring that no residual complexity survives the final transition. Residual complexity is the only threat. Complexity creates edge cases. Edge cases demand attention. Attention reintroduces relevance. The creature exists to prevent relevance from re-entering where it has already been intentionally withdrawn. From above, this withdrawal is experienced as calm certainty. Systems operate smoothly because they are not burdened with unresolved endpoints. Losses do not accumulate emotionally, analytically, or operationally. They are accepted as part of a closed domain. The creature is part of what keeps that domain closed. It does not enforce closure visibly. It enforces it by guaranteeing that nothing leaks back out. Leakage would be catastrophic at scale. Scale tolerates only clean endings. The absence of life ensures that nothing competes with this logic. Life is inherently leaky. It recycles matter, propagates information, spreads consequence across time and space. Without life, nothing carries events forward. Each interaction ends where it occurs. The creature benefits from this not as a predator benefits from prey, but as a process benefits from stability. The absence of light ensures that even hypothetical reconstruction fails. Without illumination, there is no spatial persistence. Motion cannot be replayed. Shapes cannot be recalled. Events cannot be placed relative to one another. Everything collapses into abstract disappearance. Abstract disappearance is operationally meaningless, and meaninglessness is safe. Safe systems are trusted. Trusted systems are left alone. The creature survives because it exists only where systems are trusted enough to disengage. It does not expand. Expansion would imply ambition. It does not contract. Contraction would imply vulnerability. It remains exactly coextensive with the deepest assumption that some regions exist solely to absorb endings. The creature does not challenge this assumption. It fulfills it with perfect consistency. Consistency is the strongest form of invisibility. Inconsistent phenomena provoke investigation. Consistent phenomena become background. The creature is background, not because it is small or weak, but because it never deviates. Every interaction resolves fully, identically in outcome, if not in form. Silence follows. Models remain intact. Attention stays elsewhere. Even imagination fails here. There is nothing to imagine because imagination requires gaps. Gaps require uncertainty. Uncertainty has been eliminated. The deep does not hide secrets. It has no need to. It simply ends things thoroughly enough that no secret can persist. This thoroughness is not cruel, it is neutral, it is not hostile, it does not oppose, it does not act against anything. It completes processes that have already reached the end of their interpretive value. The creature is not the cause of disappearance. It is the final condition that ensures disappearance remains complete. Completion is quiet. Quiet prevents memory. Memory prevents forgetting. Forgetting is essential. Without forgetting, systems would collapse under accumulated irrelevance. The deep exists so that forgetting can occur without consequence. The creature exists so that forgetting remains flawless. As long as there are places defined not by what can be done there, but by what is allowed to end there, something will continue to operate in those places, not asserting itself, not announcing its presence, not demanding recognition. It will simply remain perfectly synchronized with finality, ensuring that nothing ever returns from the deepest silence, unfinished, unresolved, or capable of disturbing the fragile economy of attention that keeps the rest of the world functioning at all. At the furthest extension of this condition, the deep ceases to function even as an idea of elsewhere. Elsewhere implies relation A here, from which it can be distinguished, a boundary across which something might pass and still be counted. At terminal depth, relation collapses. What reaches this regime is no longer away from anything. It is simply no longer part of the field in which relation has meaning. The creature exists precisely at that collapse point, not bridging worlds, not separating them, but ensuring that the collapse completes without remainder. Remainder is the last vulnerability. A remainder suggests incompletion. Incompletion suggests that something might still be followed, retrieved, or understood differently if sufficient effort were applied. The creature ensures that no such suggestion survives. It does not block return. It ensures that return is conceptually impossible before physical impossibility even needs to be invoked. This distinction matters. Physical impossibility can be challenged by innovation, by investment, by persistence. Conceptual impossibility cannot. Once something is defined as beyond relevance, no mechanism exists to bring it back into concern without first dismantling the entire architecture of attention that depends on that definition. The creature survives inside that architecture, not hidden within it, but assumed away by it. Assumption is stronger than concealment. Concealment invites discovery. Assumption prevents inquiry. The deep is assumed to be finished space. Finished spaces do not generate questions. They absorb them. The creature exists as part of that absorption, guaranteeing that every descent ends cleanly enough to reinforce the assumption again and again. Reinforcement is cumulative. Over time, it becomes certainty. Certainty hardens into policy. Policy eliminates curiosity. Curiosity would be dangerous here. Curiosity would require justification. Justification would require potential return. Potential return does not exist. The absence of life ensures that nothing resists this logic. Life resists finality by default. It spreads, adapts, persists, leaves traces that insist on continuation. Without life, nothing insists. Processes terminate without protest. The creature does not suppress insistence. It arrives only after insistence has already been extinguished by depth itself. The absence of light ensures that even the idea of witnessing becomes abstract. Witnessing implies the possibility of recall. Recall requires frames, edges, contrasts. None survive. Even if an interaction were to occur at massive scale, it would not imprint itself as a memory. It would dissolve into the same undifferentiated stillness that preceded it. Stillness here is not emptiness. It is saturation. Saturation of finality. Everything that can end has already ended. Everything that arrives is immediately absorbed into that ending. The creature does not accelerate this process. It does not dramatize it. It simply ensures that the process never stalls long enough to become something else. Stalling would create narrative. Narrative would propagate upward. Propagation would demand response. Response would introduce relevance. Relevance is the one condition the creature cannot allow to form. It does not guard against relevance. It does not need to. Relevance has already been excluded by scale, by cost, by institutional design. The creature exists only after relevance has been stripped away so completely that nothing remains to defend against. This is why even catastrophic hypotheticals fail to disturb the system. Imagine something vast, something unprecedented, something that would normally demand immediate attention. At this depth, it would still resolve into silence. It would still fail to propagate consequence upward. It would still be classified as loss, as closure, as expected outcome. The creature ensures that scale never translates into significance. Significance is a surface property. Below a certain depth, significance cannot survive. The creature is the embodiment of that limit. It does not watch the surface. It does not anticipate intervention. It does not fear discovery. Fear requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires leverage. Leverage does not exist here. What exists is a perfectly closed loop. Descent, completion, silence. Over immense spans of time, this loop never accumulates into pattern. Each iteration reinforces the same conclusion. Nothing new emerges, nothing old returns. The deep remains stable not because it is static, but because everything that happens within it resolves fully and immediately. Resolution without echo is the deepest form of quiet. Quiet maintains the economy of attention above. It allows systems to focus where outcomes can still be altered, where light still frames action, where life still circulates consequence. The creature exists so that this economy never has to account for what lies beyond its reach. Not because what lies there is dangerous, not because it is unknown, but because it is finished. And so, far below light and life, beyond relation, beyond relevance, beyond memory, something continues to operate endlessly, not as a being to be encountered, not as a mystery to be solved, but as the final condition that ensures the deepest silence remains intact, allowing the rest of the world to continue as if nothing of importance could ever possibly be happening there at all. At the ultimate depth of this framework, the deep ceases even to be perceived as a limit. Limits imply the possibility of approach, of measurement, of proximity. What exists here is not a boundary, but a termination of applicability. Concepts that function elsewhere, distance, duration, influence, persistence, lose operational meaning. They do not fail dramatically. They simply stop being used. The creature exists entirely within that unused space, not because it occupies it physically, but because it is the only kind of process that can remain once applicability has ended. This is the final refinement of irrelevance. Irrelevance here is not neglect. It is resolution taken to its logical extreme. Systems do not ignore what lies at this depth. They finish with it. Finishing is a deliberate act. It closes loops, frees attention, stabilizes interpretation. The deep is finished space, by definition. The creature exists because something must ensure that finishing remains complete. Completeness is fragile only if it can be challenged. Nothing here challenges it. Every arrival is already stripped of contingency. There is no scenario in which arrival produces anything other than termination. The creature does not enforce this rule. It is expressed by it. Where contingency might linger, where fragments might persist, just long enough to resist classification, the creature ensures that resistance collapses instantly. Collapse is clean. Clean collapse leaves no gradients. Gradients are the only carriers of meaning. Without gradients, nothing can be inferred. Inference never reaches here. The absence of life ensures that nothing carries events forward in time. There is no reproduction, no adaptation, no accumulation of byproducts. The deep does not remember, because nothing inside it has any reason to remember. Memory is costly. It requires persistence against erasure. Erasure is constant here. The creature aligns with that constancy. The absence of light ensures that nothing carries events forward in space. Without illumination, space cannot be reconstructed. Orientation fails. Movement leaves no map behind. Even if something were to move across vast distances, the movement would not become trajectory. It would vanish into uniformity before it could be recalled. Recall is impossible. Impossible things are not attempted. Above, systems function because they can forget. Forgetting is not failure, it is design. Without forgetting, complexity overwhelms capacity. The deep is where forgetting is allowed to be absolute. The creature exists because forgetting must be enforced without exception. Exceptions would accumulate. Accumulation would reintroduce relevance. Relevance would force reevaluation. Reevaluation would destabilize the architecture of attention. The creature is a stabilizer of that architecture. It does not announce itself. It does not signal. It does not impose. It simply ensures that whatever enters the deepest domain completes its transition into irrelevance so thoroughly that no conceptual residue ever rises back toward the surface. This is why even catastrophic hypotheticals fail to register. Scale does not translate into significance here. Significance is a function of propagation. Nothing propagates. Everything resolves locally and completely. The creature ensures that locality remains absolute. Absolute locality is silence. Silence does not provoke response. Without response, nothing escalates. The creature does not need to adapt because the environment never changes in ways that matter. Geological timescales pass, but they pass uniformly. Pressure remains, darkness remains, absence remains. These are not conditions to survive. They are conditions that define survival itself. The creature does not outlast time. It is expressed by time. It does not inhabit depth. It is articulated by depth. It does not hide in silence. It exists, as silence is completion. As long as there are systems that must function by narrowing their field of concern, as long as there are domains designated as terminal so that others can remain actionable, something will continue to operate in those terminal domains, not as an adversary, not as an unknown, not as a secret, but as the final, silent mechanism that ensures that what is finished remains finished. Far below light, far below life, beyond applicability, beyond recovery, beyond inquiry, where endings do not announce themselves, where disappearance is indistinguishable from equilibrium, where nothing persists long enough to matter, something continues, endlessly, flawlessly, and without witness, ensuring that the deepest silence remains intact so that the world above never has to question where its attention must finally stop. At this depth, the notion of observation itself becomes obsolete. Observation presumes the possibility of feedback, that what is seen might alter what is done next. Here, nothing that occurs can influence anything beyond itself. The creature exists entirely beyond the feedback horizon. What happens here does not return information, correction, or warning. It returns nothing at all. This is not because observation fails, but because observation has no function left to perform. Function defines interest. Without function, interest collapses. The deep is not monitored continuously, because continuous monitoring would generate no actionable difference. Any signal obtained would terminate in the same conclusion: irretrievable, unresponsive, complete. Over time, systems learn to trust this conclusion implicitly. Trust reduces vigilance. Vigilance withdraws. The creature exists inside that withdrawal, not exploiting it, but depending on it in the same way gravity depends on mass. Dependence here is structural, not strategic. The creature does not gain advantage. Advantage implies competition. There is no competition. It does not secure territory. Territory implies boundary. Boundaries have dissolved. It does not defend itself. Defense implies threat. There is none. It simply persists as the final alignment of process with condition. Alignment is total. Everything that arrives has already failed elsewhere. Systems do not send intact, valuable, or recoverable objects to these depths intentionally. What arrives is already compromised, already marginal, already written off. The creature does not diminish value. It encounters only what has been stripped of value long before contact. This is the most important distinction. The creature never takes what might still matter. It exists only after mattering has ended. That is why its activity never provokes reaction. Reaction follows loss. Here, loss has already been accepted. Acceptance is irreversible. Once accepted, outcomes are no longer negotiated. The absence of life guarantees that nothing renegotiates outcomes biologically. No organism scavenges in ways that propagate evidence upward. No metabolism introduces heat, waste, or secondary motion that might register elsewhere. Everything resolves into the same chemical and mechanical baseline. The creature operates in that baseline, indistinguishable from it. The absence of light guarantees that nothing renegotiates outcomes visually. No shape persists, no silhouette remains, no motion defines trajectory. Space exists, but it is never retained as spatial memory. Without spatial memory, nothing can be reconstructed. Without reconstruction, nothing can be reinterpreted. Reinterpretation is impossible here. Impossible things are not attempted. Time passes, but time does not accumulate. Without markers, duration loses structure. There are no cycles to count, no repetitions to compare. Long spans of nothing are not empty. They are simply uninterrupted. The creature exists comfortably in uninterrupted time because nothing pressures it to change. Change would require stimulus. Stimulus does not arrive. Rare intrusions occur: objects that descend too far, structures that fail completely, signals that thin beyond recovery. Each intrusion resolves immediately, not violently, not dramatically, completely. Completion is so thorough that even the idea of an event becomes unnecessary. There is only before, and then there is nothing that follows. Nothing that follows is the defining feature. From above, this nothing is interpreted correctly as terminal. No one asks what happened beyond that point, because the answer would not alter response. No response remains. The creature exists because systems must be allowed to stop asking at some point. Stopping questions is essential. Without stopping, systems collapse under infinite inquiry. The deep is where inquiry is permitted to end. The creature is what ensures inquiry never has a reason to restart. It does not interfere with models. It completes them. It does not challenge assumptions. It fulfills them. It does not resist understanding. It exists beyond where understanding is applied. This is why it is not mythologized. Myths require survivors. They require fragments. They require stories that travel. Nothing travels upward from here. The deep absorbs everything, including narrative potential. The creature leaves no story. It leaves only silence that fits expectations so perfectly that expectation never has to change. As long as systems continue to operate by excluding what cannot be acted upon, as long as attention remains a finite resource that must be conserved, something will continue to operate in the deepest silence, not as an unknown threat, not as a hidden intelligence, not as a secret waiting to be uncovered, but as the final condition that guarantees that some parts of the world remain closed forever, not by force, but by agreement. Far below light, far below life, beyond observation, beyond response, beyond necessity, where the world allows itself to stop caring, and where something continues to function precisely so that stopping remains possible, stable, and absolute. At this depth, even the concept of loss dissolves into neutrality. Loss implies deprivation relative to a prior state of possession or expectation. Here, expectation has already been withdrawn. What enters this regime is no longer counted among things that could be retained. The creature does not cause loss. It operates only after loss has been fully internalized by systems above. It exists in a zone where subtraction has already been completed conceptually, leaving nothing to be taken. This distinction matters because it removes conflict entirely. There is no contest between presence and absence, no tension between retention and disappearance. Everything that reaches this depth has already been reclassified as non-returning. The creature does not accelerate that reclassification. It exists only to ensure that nothing contradicts it after the fact. Contradiction is the only remaining instability. Instability invites revision. Revision would require attention. Attention has already been withdrawn. The deep functions as a place where withdrawal is final. Once attention leaves, nothing ever calls it back. The creature ensures that this remains true. It does not call attention to itself. It does not need to. It depends on the fact that attention cannot be justified here under any operational framework. Operational frameworks do not reward completeness. They reward utility. There is no utility here. Without utility, even perfect knowledge would be inert. Inert knowledge decays faster than ignorance. Ignorance can provoke exploration. Inert knowledge provokes nothing. The creature is immune to both because it exists where neither applies. The absence of life ensures that nothing reacts dynamically. Reaction would introduce variability. Variability would create signal. Signal would require interpretation. Without life, the environment remains chemically and mechanically quiet enough that everything resolves into equilibrium immediately. The creature does not disturb that equilibrium. It reinforces it by ensuring that no secondary processes persist. The absence of light ensures that even conceptual visualization fails. Without illumination, there is no geometry to preserve, no orientation to recall. Events cannot be replayed mentally because they never become images. Without imagery, nothing becomes memorable. Memory requires shape. Shape dissolves instantly. Memory does not form. Without memory, there is no accumulation of doubt. Doubt is the precursor to investigation. The creature exists because investigation must end somewhere. This ending point is not arbitrary. It is dictated by cost, by probability, by diminishing returns. The deeper something goes, the less leverage knowledge about it provides. Eventually, leverage reaches zero. That is where the creature operates. It exists exactly where leverage disappears. Leverage defines relevance. Relevance defines observation. Observation defines reality. Beyond relevance, reality still exists, but it is no longer negotiated. The creature is not part of negotiation. It exists after negotiation has ended. It does not impose finality. It ensures that finality is honored. It does not threaten the world above. It stabilizes it by preventing unresolved endpoints from accumulating into conceptual debt. Conceptual debt is dangerous. Unresolved questions pile up. Piles demand attention. Attention is finite. The deep absorbs conceptual debt permanently. The creature ensures that absorption is total. It does not need to move frequently. Frequency is irrelevant when each interaction is terminal. It does not need to be efficient. Efficiency implies optimization against constraint. Here, constraint is absolute. There is no alternative outcome to optimize toward. Absolute constraint simplifies everything. The creature is simple not because it lacks complexity, but because complexity has no place to persist. Any complexity that reaches this depth is erased immediately. What remains is alignment with inevitability. Alignment leaves no trace. Traceability is the enemy. Without traceability, nothing can be followed back toward cause. Cause becomes unnecessary. Above, explanations settle into silence comfortably. Silence is interpreted correctly as closure. Closure allows systems to continue functioning without collapse. The creature exists because closure must never be violated. Violation would reopen inquiry. Inquiry would spread upward. Upward spread would demand resources. Resources would be wasted. The creature prevents waste by ensuring that nothing from the deepest regions ever returns incomplete enough to matter. It does not guard the boundary. It is the boundary's completion, far below light, far below life, beyond loss, beyond recovery, beyond explanation. Where nothing is taken because nothing remains to be taken, where disappearance is indistinguishable from equilibrium, where finality is not dramatic but routine, something continues to operate endlessly, not asserting itself, not announcing presence, not waiting for recognition, but existing as the final silent condition that allows the rest of the world to function without ever having to look back. At the absolute end of this logic, there is nothing left to add, because addition itself would imply incompleteness. The deepest regions no longer require interpretation, explanation, or even acknowledgement. They exist as a resolved remainder, a necessary remainder, where everything that cannot be acted upon is allowed to finish without consequence. The creature exists not as an exception to this resolution, but as its most precise expression. It does not dominate the deep. It does not define it. It ensures that definition never becomes necessary. What operates there does not persist in the way surface processes persist. It does not accumulate history. It does not evolve narrative. It does not generate consequences that ripple outward. Each interaction collapses fully into the environment, leaving no edge that could be followed back toward cause or intent. The deep does not remember, because remembering would require something to remain unresolved. Nothing remains unresolved. This is the final condition, a domain where resolution is immediate and absolute, where disappearance is not loss, but completion, where silence is not absence, but confirmation that nothing further is required. The creature exists because this condition must be enforced without exception. One incomplete ending would be enough to reopen inquiry. One fragment would be enough to destabilize certainty. One echo would be enough to demand attention. None occur. Above, systems continue to function because they are permitted to forget. Forgetting here is not negligence. It is structural necessity. Without it, attention would fragment, priorities would blur, and the world would become unmanageable. The deep exists so that forgetting can be total somewhere. The creature exists so that this totality is never compromised. It does not threaten the surface world. It does not interact with it. It does not even acknowledge it. It exists entirely beyond the point where acknowledgement would matter. This is why it is never found. Not because it hides, not because it is fast, not because it is clever, but because discovery would be meaningless. Meaningless discoveries do not propagate. They dissolve immediately, like everything else at depth. The absence of life ensures that nothing reacts. The absence of light ensures that nothing frames. The absence of return ensures that nothing accumulates. Together, these absences form a closed system where processes can continue indefinitely without ever becoming something that must be known. The creature is not ancient in any mythic sense. It does not precede the world above. It emerges naturally wherever systems divide reality into what must be managed and what may be concluded. As long as such divisions exist, something like this will exist as well, not as a monster, not as a mystery, but as a function of finality, a function of forgetting. a function of allowing the rest of the world to proceed without carrying the weight of everything that falls out of reach. And so, far below light, far below life, beyond observation, beyond relevance, beyond concern, something continues to operate endlessly, not waiting, not watching, not choosing, simply ensuring that endings remain endings, that silence remains unbroken, and that the deepest regions of the world remain exactly what they have been decided to be. Places where nothing returns, nothing accumulates, and nothing ever insists on being remembered.
We upload new videos every single day, so make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps the channel grow. Tell us in the comments what you'd like to see next. Your ideas might be in our next upload. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of our community. Stay tuned, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.